So now we'll have the conference with Lucien Barsan. Ideally, we are waited at 6:30 p.m. But we know the events. Sometimes it's
later.
We can control the flowing of time, but ideally, I'm just telling you ideally what are the time.
Then I guess it's up to me to enforce the time.
Well, I don't know. We're gonna feel, and then I propose us to have dinner at the very same place of yesterday, because it's just nearby Felipe's place, and well, we were able to chat yesterday. Yeah. So that's it. Those who are still here tomorrow in the morning and can help me with the arrumação da casa para entregar para a moça, eu agradeço. So it doesn't concern you, so I can say it in English.
I understood it anyway.
You won't be making some cleaning of the house, I see. So we are.
Do you assume I'm too bourgeois for that?
That's all. So we are very honored and happy to receive Lucien Barsan to his conference, The Effects of Communism in Human Mind and Human Spirit. I'll ask you, first of all, Lucien, if you don't mind, just explain to us, first of all, those who don't know, what is the Freedom Alternative and this network, on what it consists, and once again, thank you for coming.
Right. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. I don't think I'm particularly worthy, or I don't think I particularly deserve to be here, but he believed I do, so I guess you can take it on him. On a more serious note, I apologize for speaking in English. My Portuguese is rusty, to put it mildly, terrible, to be more honest with you. So as a result, I will have to, resort to the English language. The Freedom Alternative. The Freedom Alternative, as a name, exists only for 4 years, but the group itself has been around for about 15 years or so. And it has gradually grown to the point that now I can honestly call it in public the Freedom Alternative Network. Because there's enough of us in enough institutions that we can safely say that if we want some things to happen in politics, we might actually get them, or at the very least be able to seriously influence them. What I mean by influencing, we essentially studied, at least the founders of it, including myself, we studied the methods of the communists on how to influence narratives, how to create narratives, and how to influence existing narratives in order for the public narrative to go into the direction desired by the influencer. This is something that the communists have had 100 years to specialize on, and they've become really good at it. But we started from the moral premise that these are mainly tools, like a drilling machine, like a hammer, like, a tool. It doesn't have a moral value in and of itself. You can use a hammer to kill a person or to build a house with it. So we believed we started from the moral premise that the tools of influencing narratives, of creating narratives, of spreading narratives are just amoral tools, and we should be using them as well for much more morally worthy goals, rather than in our opinion, the immoral worthy goals used by the left. So we studied their tactics, and we started applying them for our own goals as well. I was explaining to a few of you before we started the camera. For instance, it's a very simple one. We never say conservative, or we try to avoid, never say never, but we try to avoid saying conservative in public. We say we're normal people. The world is divided between normal people and leftists. And it's the leftists that are the problem. Normal people are okay, that's why they're normal. This is a very simple flip-flop of the rhetoric that was used by most of the communist regimes, including the Romanian one, in their mainstream press at the time, when they would say that the world is divided between good people who are members of the Communist Party, pay their dues in time, go to union meetings, go to party meetings, and the potentially reactionary rest. That's how they divided the world. And I'm like, hold on a second, we can play that game too. So we flip the script essentially, but this is a very smaller aspect. In general, we try to do everything that the left did, but in reverse. So for instance, they destroyed the education system in most countries of Europe by infiltrating and subverting the institutions themselves. How? By using the existing rules and getting in and becoming, you have first one leftist director of a school, and then that leftist director slowly puts aside the conservative teachers and only keeps the ones that are easily controllable and brings in some of his leftist friends in the school. So within 20 years, that school becomes a leftist one entirely. We're trying to do exactly the opposite. We're sending one or two of our people in an institution, and then that person slowly over time puts aside the most radical of the existing structure, brings in maybe some of his friends, or not necessarily his friends, but people who are more open to learning new things. And slowly over time, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years, depends on the size of the institution, that institution becomes a normal institution instead of a leftist one. Because we have to remember, we're normal people, not leftists. So that's basically the overarching goal of the Freedom Alternative Network. Now, of course, I will never have the audacity to claim that we're going to change the world. No. We come with more modest goals. If by the end of our lifetimes the amount of disease in our culture is slightly smaller than it was when we came of age, that's awesome. We're leaving a slightly better world for our children, and then our children hopefully will continue to do things, because we believe that we look at things from a civilizational standpoint, and at a civilizational scale 20 years is essentially nothing. Civilizations change over a span of at least a century, usually 2 or 3 centuries, and sometimes even more than that. One particular example would be the Orthodox Greeks in Turkey. The Ottoman Empire has taken Constantinople 600 years ago or so, and you still have Orthodox Greeks to this day, entire villages of them. Because some civilizations don't change even in face of the harshest adversity, even for hundreds of years. So that's why we don't believe that we can change the world by electing the next president that maybe will be our guy. And nah, it's not how. We don't believe that that's how reality works. We think that things change over time, and by slowly growing a next generation, or not necessarily a next generation, but rather a next class. Like you people are on the Olavo de Carvalho class, and you're a class of people who just function differently, and you're hoping to be an example for those around you who maybe slowly over time they will themselves follow a more knowledge and wisdom oriented lifestyle. That's very similar to what we're accomplishing, except we don't have much philosophy oriented goals, but more practical ones, because we're agitators more than philosophers. We leave the philosophy to philosophers, and we take the political operative type of activity because we feel we're better at that, better suited at that, rather than at philosophy. So yeah, that's basically the shortest version that I can describe. And the public version of the Freedom Alternative is the website and my YouTube channel. That's how he found me. So yeah. But on the YouTube channel, I usually take one particular topic, deconstruct it. Sometimes it has something to do with the news, sometimes not so much. For instance, most recently, I evaluated the way the city of Dearborn in Michigan in the United States has changed over time due to mass immigration from the Middle East, and how it has changed. And it turns out it's a little bit more complicated than it seemed at first. And I just went there and studied it on the field, and then made a report about it, and it's publicly available on my YouTube channel. Just yesterday I arrived from Warsaw, Poland, after a tour around Poland, around the country, and I arrived yesterday because he invited me, because otherwise I would have stayed for at least another week in Poland. And I will do the same thing with many of the civilizational shifts that are going on in Poland. Now I went and studied them in the field. Of course, I'll have to think more about it, reevaluate the footage that I've taken there, and then eventually and there's always going to be the public version and the private version. For our network, we put things in a bit more perspective, but also for the public, just so hopefully, eventually, slowly, and it's been happening. More people are thinking that, oh my God, I need to learn more. I thought I'm smart, and as it turns out, not so much. And yeah, so that's the shortest version for Freedom Alternative that I can put.
Pretty good.
Right. So, as I said, I didn't structure a particular speech for this evening because, well, for starters, it would have been quite difficult for me to do it, and second of all, you're Olavo de Carvalho class, you're accustomed to rather unstructured type of speech and speech that goes for hours and hours. I've been told that yesterday you met with Professor Gugu, who as usual went a little bit longer, because that's how he goes. When I met Professor Gugu, we went for 14 hours. So it's yeah, of course he went for 7 hours. Of course, that's okay, and that's okay. So yeah, I haven't structured a particular speech, but I've asked a few of you to tell me what you guys want to hear. Yeah. But since I came up with the title "The Effects of Communism on the Human Mind," I guess I should start a little bit with that, and then devolve into the particular topics that you have suggested to me over the last 2 hours or so. Now, it's a very broad topic, of course, but the short version is pretty much like this. When it comes to a totalitarian regime, particularly a left-leaning one, although in my opinion there is no such thing as right-wing totalitarianism, the far right is essentially anarcho-capitalism. But let's say right-wing authoritarian type of regimes, those tend to have those effects too, but to a much lesser extent. But the left-wing variety of totalitarianism tends to disobey a very basic rule of politics, namely that when you write policy and try to enact policy on a society, you have to think about the unintended consequences. What can happen if you do this? Things that you haven't foreseen in the first place. Like, for instance, a very basic version, let's ban smoking in the restaurants. Well, what happens? People will meet in private restaurants that are not open to the public, and they're still gonna smoke. Yeah. That's an unintended consequence of the smoking ban. But it works with larger systems as well. So with the communist regime, for instance, they try to make us all live like a community and live the collectivist dream. What ended up is less of a community than ever in the country's history. This is true particularly in Romania. It's true to a certain extent in other countries of Eastern Europe, but the worst versions were in Romania and Albania. Enver Hoxha was even worse than Ceausescu. I've done an entire video, it's about 1 hour, of the story of communism in Albania. You should be watching that one, where I explained in great detail how Enver Hoxha ruled his own fiefdom, because we were essentially a fiefdom. But the thing is that they tried to make us live the collectivist dream. And how? Well, for starters, they brought in a lot of people from the countryside. They brought them forcibly into the cities, opened up the gigantic factories, which turned out, just as they've been warned, turned out not to be economically efficient. But the communists didn't care about that, because economics is a science for the bourgeoisie, so they don't have to necessarily give a damn about that. In any event, they brought a lot of people in, and those people have had their own communities rooted on that particular land for 400, 500, 800, maybe 1,000 years. And they were suddenly moved 500 kilometers away in Bucharest, in Timișoara, in Iași, in the bigger cities of Romania. Suddenly they had no community. And that particular thing eventually ended up into the situation that I've encountered today. That's why I was late 1 hour, because I looked on the map and I'm like, okay, this street is relatively hard to access by bus or by metro, but I can take the metro up to a point and then just walk through the streets, and I'll just ask around. And I did ask around, and nobody knew. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons is because most of the people living in this area are not rooted here in Bucharest for at least one generation. Many of them, they were moved forcibly in the 80s or in the 70s. And they never had to care about this, because this wasn't their community. Their community is in whatever smaller town or village or wherever they were brought from. So as a result, this was one of the first unintended consequences. The lack of community, even though the proposal was to create a grand collectivist community. The second consequence, especially on the human mind, is the acutization of primary instincts. And this is something that is very still controversial in a way to speak about. In the 80s in particular, this country has gone through a de facto famine, and a state-enforced famine. It wasn't by accident, it wasn't because of a natural disaster, it wasn't because of a war, or it was because of a war, the war of the regime against its own people, if you want. So as a result, there were plenty of shortages of basic goods. I'm talking about 7 or 8 hours queues for a liter of milk per month. Rationed bread, rationed rice, rationed cooking oil, rationed, you name it. And many of the goods weren't even rationed, they were just not available, period. So as a result, because of this situation, a lot of people, of course, they did go to queue for 8 hours because there wasn't much other choice. But you know, wait for 8 hours in a weather like this, in the middle of the sun at 40 degrees, and you have to wake up at 4 a.m., start queuing at 6, and maybe at 3 p.m. you get your milk. Maybe. If you're lucky. Sometimes people would queue for 10 hours, and at the end of the queue, they didn't get anything. And keep in mind that get is a very weird verb because it implies that you're getting it for free. No, you still had to pay for it. You would have the privilege of buying some milk, which was also overly priced, of course. So, you know, when you have this situation for every once in several years, for instance, when people go in queue like this for the next iPhone. Yeah, but they do go there voluntarily, and they do that maybe once in several years. In Romania, during communism in the 80s, you wouldn't go there voluntarily. You had to eat. So you would go there whether you liked it or not, and you do that 3 times a week, 4 times a week, for a decade. That ended up having an effect that is still lingering to this day. I mean, if you were to speak Romanian, if not, I will definitely send you some links with examples. When a new store gives in something either for free or for very cheap, like, you know, a frying pan or whatever, you'll see a lot of especially older people who are at the peak of their maturity during the famine, still going there and physically fighting with each other to get more pans for cheap or for free. Even though, you know, the store owners are like, we have enough pans for the whole freaking Bucharest. I mean, you don't have to fight for it. They still do. That's an instinct that was that of course exists in all humans. We all are built by evolution or by God to fight for resources, to fight for food. But once you have to physically do it for several times a week for a decade, it becomes a much more acute instinct than for us living in modernity, where you don't really have to fight for food. I mean, even the very poor can afford to be obese. So, you know, this is a very nice period to live in. But in the 80s, it was probably the worst period to live in. My grandmother, for instance, she lived, especially my great-grandmother was even better at doing this comparison because she was born in the 1890s and died in 2004. So, you know, I was joking with her in 2003 that, you know, you lived for 3 centuries, which was technically not true, but you get the joke. And, you know, she lived in World War I, had bombs falling on her house during World War I. She lived through the interbellum period, through World War II, through communism, and through 14 years of post-communism. And in 2001, I have an audio tape recording with her. She was telling me that the worst period by far was between 1980 and 1989, or January 1990, whatever. Because even during World War II, yes, there were bombs falling all over the place, but there was still some semblance of order, and food wasn't rationed. And yes, food was more expensive because that's what happens during wartime, but you could buy it. During the 1980s, even if you had the money, you still couldn't buy it because, you know, the regime said it's enough food for you, comrade. And these long queues for everything, again, I mean, these were it had come to a point, especially after 1985, it had come to a point that you would just randomly walk down the street and you would see a long queue, and instinctively you would sit on that queue as well, not knowing what's on the end of it. And the phrase was "se dă ceva," as in they are giving something. That would be the most decent translation into English, because it didn't matter what they were selling at the end of the queue. You probably need it in your house anyway, whether it was an item of clothing or shoes or some food or, I don't know, detergent, or it didn't matter because you had a shortage of anything anyway. Yeah. So you would see a queue and you just stand in that particular line because you had very few choices. And that particular situation has created a long-term effect that you can still see it today, even in the children. I mean, people born in 1990, 91, 92, 93, so, you know, after the regime. Apparently actually I would say a lot of them, I don't know if the majority, but definitely a significant minority at the very least, they seem to have inherited from their parents this particular type of fear that, you know, food is going to run out. So, you know, I got to hoard more. because who knows when I can find it. You've seen something like this in Berlin when the wall fell. That's why it was called the Banana Revolution. I had the privilege of talking to a truck driver who was doing banana delivery from West Berlin to East Berlin immediately after the wall fell. And he was telling me that, look, at the beginning of the revolution, immediately after the wall fell, he had 5 trucks, and by the end of the 6 months after the wall fell, he had 55 trucks, and still were not enough to fill in the orders. He would do 20 or 30 deliveries per day to East Berlin, because the East Berlinese people, just like the Romanian ones, they thought that the bananas would run out, of course, just like they usually do under communism. So they would go in and buy all of the bananas available, and the capitalist store was like, okay, and phoned in the distributor, bring me more bananas. I guess they needed a lot of them, and they kept on delivering them, and they kept on, and for about 6 months, it took about 6 months until the Berlinese understood that, no, wait a minute, the bananas won't run out this time. There are actually going to be bananas tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and a week after, and 5 months from now, there'll still be bananas in the store. But up until 1989, that wasn't the case. And again, in Berlin, it was the banana revolution. Here, it should have been, I don't know, the milk revolution or something like that. I mean, at least in Berlin, you could still get milk. It was still rationed, and it was still pretty difficult to find, but you could find it, and you didn't have to queue for 8 hours, but you had to here. And I mean, if you ask around Bucharest, around older people, they would still have ways to figure it out without queuing too much. They would still have to queue, but not too much, because Bucharest, of course, was the capital, and as a result, the regime made an effort to, at least for those few tourists that would arrive, to make it look like a normal functioning country. But if you went outside Bucharest, things were even harsher. Usually it was Bucharest and Sibiu County that were a little bit different than the rest of the country. Sibiu County because it was ruled by Ceausescu's son. So as a result, that particular county was also one of the few, if not the only county, so excluding Bucharest, that did not have extreme shortages. Everyone else, though, about 21 million people, had to queue for everything. And that created a long-term effect that is still visible today. So yeah, lack of community, wanting to physically struggle for even the most basic things, and of course the lack of trust, because you couldn't trust anyone. During communist times, there was the generalized feeling that no matter what you say, not only can, but will for sure be used against you sometime in the future. It's not very different from the situation today when you have some public figure having their Facebook posts dug up from 10 years ago and then used against them today. But at least the consequences today is that maybe you lose your job at worst, or maybe the New York Times, a former newspaper, will write something bad about you. That's not a very serious consequence. In comparison, in the 80s, one of the serious consequences, you have your rations cut. So technically you would be sentenced to starve to death. Of course, very few people did starve to death because everyone was relying on some underground networks to solve that issue. But still, it was a very serious consequence. There was a reasonable possibility that you would starve to death. So yeah, that was one of the consequences. The second one was you would have your qualifications withdrawn. So you could wake up that you're a qualified engineer, and because you said something that someone didn't like, you might end up being forced to work the fields. Like unqualified, non-bourgeois type of work, just because the regime says so, because the state owned everything. So, and even though on paper they didn't, in practice they owned the citizens too, in any relevant respect. So of course that over time created a severe lack of trust among the populace. Now this is where disinformation comes very useful, knowledge about disinformation. Because a lot of people had this feeling that everyone is listening, and wherever you are, it was even the say that I had to work a lot to convince my grandmother that this is no longer the case. The walls have ears. They use the pereții au urechi. The walls have ears. It wasn't exactly true. In fact, the Securitate service during communists, our KGB essentially, had fewer employees then than the Romanian intelligence service has today, at a smaller population than during communism. So it wasn't that huge. Now, of course, many people will argue, yes, but they had a lot of paid informants, just like the Stasi had in the GDR. The same thing was here, true. But even with all the informers, because all of the archives of the Securitate are now completely opened, you can see that there weren't that many of them. The vast majority of the population had no affiliation with the Securitate, and in fact, in most areas of the country, you would not be listened to, and the regime could not do anything to you because they couldn't hear you. So that's, and of course, the operatives for the regime knew that very well. They knew the reality on the field, just like everyone, just like we know it today, but we didn't know it in the 80s. So what they did was invest in propaganda and disinformation and make sure that everyone believed that the regime can hear you. At least in the DDR, in the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, that there it was true, because about a quarter of the population was on the payroll of the Stasi. So there it was reasonable to believe that you could be heard anywhere by the regime. Here, however, because the country was geographically bigger, it was pretty difficult for the regime to hear you in most of the country. Yeah, sure, in the center of a big city, sure, but if you were somewhere in the countryside, no one would care. But the regime invested heavily in this, in spreading the disinformation that the regime can hear anything, that they can listen anything. I've had the privilege of meeting people who worked at the phone company, the state phone company. There was, of course, the wide understanding that the regime is listening to all of the phone calls. And these guys have not only have told me, but they have taken me into the old phone houses that were used at the time to distribute phone calls, and technically proved it to me that it was impossible for the regime to listen to more than 80% of the phone calls. Yes, the international phone calls were almost all of them listened to, but the domestic ones, most of them, the regime couldn't listen to them even if they wanted to. But because they invested so heavily in propaganda and disinformation, almost everyone was convinced that this was definitely the case. So as a result, it created a lot of distrust and lack of trust. And this is one of the reasons why in the 90s in particular this country was so dysfunctional, because unlike the Hungarians, who didn't have this kind of disinformation spread among them, or the Czechs for that matter, although the Czechs is a bit more complicated, but the Hungarians and the Yugoslavs in particular, they didn't have this kind of disinformation spread. So for us it was a little bit more difficult to gain again the trust in each other. Because on one hand you didn't know who used to be a collaborator with the former Securitate, now you do because it's public information, but at the time you couldn't. And second of all, we were just coming out of a regime that intentionally taught us not to trust each other. Not intentionally, but unwittingly, because the purpose of the regime was not to make us not to trust each other, but in reality this is what happened, because of course the regime had assumed that we would all, well, how should I say this, convert to communism, I guess, because I regard communism as a cult. But of course most people didn't. So as a result, most people would hide from the public the fact that they would go to church, or the fact that they would pray at home, or the fact that they have a distant aunt in the United States or in West Germany or in Spain or whatever. And they would try their best to send letters without them knowing this. Without the regime finding out about this. And there were ways to do that. I was supposed to do a documentary about the life of a chap who was the chief architect of the first network of Protestants in particular. They were mostly Protestants who were delivering letters from Romania to Radio Free Europe in München. But he bailed on the opportunity for now. He'll probably come back to a better understanding, but it's going to take some further time. But the point is that there were ways to send letters abroad without the regime finding out. But then again, even if you knew how to do it, would you trust to tell your neighbor about it? What if the neighbor is an informant of the Securitate? Maybe he is, maybe he's not. Okay, statistically likely he's not, but you know this now. In the 80s you didn't know. In the 80s you would assume almost everyone, excluding maybe your direct family, although as it turns out after the archives were opened, that sometimes even your direct family ended up being an informant to the Securitate. So yeah. So this created a heavy climate of distrust, which you can still find it on the streets of Romanian cities to this day. The people are not necessarily rude, but they're definitely less trustworthy with each other, in the sense that you don't have the immediate assumption of goodwill. You have to work for it, although today you have to work for it for like 5 seconds, but you still have to work for it. You cannot take it for granted, as you can, for instance, in Jordan. I've just recently been in Jordan. In Jordan, people are nice because they haven't been through this kind of nonsense that we've been through. So, and this is especially true with everyone older than 35. With young people, it's a little bit more of a mishmash. Even they don't know what they want. So it's going to take a while until that will be figured out. I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. So yeah, these are the main 3 effects that are on the human spirit. Now, of course, on behavior, there is a lot to talk about because the regime was in everything, in all and everything. That's we used to say it ironically, partidul e în tot și toate. The party is in all and everything. But on a more serious note, they kind of were in all and everything because, yeah, sure, if you wanted to write a poem in the 1st grade, probably the regime wouldn't care. But if you're already in the 5th grade and you wanted to write a poem, someone from the apparatchiks of the regime would have to see through it before it's been allowed to be published. Now, of course, most of the time you would be allowed to publish it, but sometimes you weren't. Now, there have been cases of 12-year-olds being censored because their poems or little stories, or what kind of stories can a 12-year-old write. But apparently some of them were so haram by the regime standards that they were deemed rather not publishable. So yeah, the party was in all and everything. This is probably why during the '89 revolution, one of the demands of the revolution that was actually fulfilled is absolute free speech, because everyone had seen what happens when you say, well, I'm from free speech, but no buts. Yeah, it probably won't hold for much longer, because Europe again is turning its back on its classical liberal roots, and yeah, it's probably going to be. I'm not particularly optimistic over the long run on this particular aspect, on expression, because expression has its tendency of rooting out bad ideas, not necessarily replacing them with good ideas, but definitely when you leave people alone, they kind of root out most of the bad ideas, and apparently that's not acceptable in the current year. So it is what it is. So yeah, this so it was the effect on self-censorship, on behavior. Self-censorship was a thing during communism, and it still is to a certain extent today, especially with older people. Other effects on behavior. Oh yeah, I would say I don't want to call it. I think it would be better to call it sexual Puritanism. And the reason I say this is because Romanian communism had a feature that didn't exist anywhere else in the communist world, namely that here abortion was banned. But it was not banned for Christian or conservative reasons or for morality reasons. No, it was banned for a very utilitarian reason. The regime calculated on paper and said, if we want to build our socialist state, we just really, really need another 8 million people. And we have to grow 8 million people. So we're going to ban abortion and force everyone to breed as much as possible because we want to grow our population so more slaves can work in our factories, essentially. It was very, very crude type of calculation. And up until 1967, in Europe, Romania used to have like the second or the first, sometimes most liberal abortion law. And very few abortions happened because it was legal, but it was rarely, because the population was already quite Christian conservative anyway, so very few abortions happened. But then when the commies banned not just abortion, but also de facto contraceptives. Now, contraceptives officially were not banned, but in practice, you couldn't find milk, so why would you find condoms or the pill? Of course, you couldn't, most of the time, except for the far west, where they would import them illegally from Yugoslavia, but that's a separate story for another day. So as a result, it created, how should I put this without sounding too awful, but it created a nation of sexually frustrated people. Because, you know, if contraceptives are not available, if abortion is banned, then most people would just refrain from having sex. And, you know, that's okay for 40 days during the fasting, but it's not particularly okay for 4,000 days. So, yeah. And that created a certain type of attitude that is only now dying off. So, you know, communism fell 30 years ago, and it's still pretty common because 2 generations essentially have to go have to physically die in order for the attitude to change. And it created a very weird situation, sexually conservative communists, essentially, if you can imagine that. The exact opposite happened in Poland, where abortion was forcibly legalized, even though the Catholic Church opposed it, and today abortion is illegal in Poland. Was not just were forcibly legalized in direct opposition to the will of the people, but was also heavily promoted, much like you see Planned Parenthood doing it today. The Polish communists were doing it in the 70s as a desirable lifestyle choice, and there it created, nowadays you have the opposite reaction to that. It's one of the reasons the Polish population today is probably the most conservative in the European Union, is because the communist regime there forced a type of extreme degeneracy on them, essentially. Here it's more of a mix, because again we had abortion ban, but on the other hand we had a lot of friendship of the peoples, multiculturalism, mass immigration kind of thing. Because history books say that Romania's borders were closed, but that's not exactly accurate. They were closed for us. If we wanted to leave even for 2 days, go to attend a conference in Paris or whatever and then come back, well, you could technically do that, but it was very complicated and was under strict conditions. If you want, I can tell you exact the conditions. But if I wanted to leave permanently, that was a totally no-go. So they were closed for us. But if anyone wanted to come in, they were more than welcome, and they could stay if they want, and foreigners could leave whenever they want. It wasn't like North Korea, where they would be held prisoners then. No, they could come and go whenever they want. So as a result, the regime was making a lot of money off of particularly German and Swedish tourists who would come at the Black Sea, and to a point that some of the Black Sea resorts were inaccessible for us locals, because the regime would fence them off and only accept payment in hard currency, which you are forbidden as a Romanian to own a hard currency. So as a result, the regime was able to launder a lot of good money from there, and again at the expense of the population, which is one of the reasons why our Black Sea resorts are still pretty full of especially old people today, even though they're not particularly great. Odessa's Ukraine is actually nicer, but they're still very full, and the old people intentionally go to 2 or 3 of them in particular, because those were the ones that were forbidden for the locals. It's the same story in Albania, where the Durrës beach, which is not particularly great, they have other beaches in Albania that are much better than that, but they all go to Durrës, and they built a huge highway to get there faster. Because that was entirely fenced off by the regime and was forbidden for the average Albanian, so now they all go there. Just like they built a nightclub in Enver Hoxha's pyramid. It was built to be the dictator's museum of legacy, so they built a nightclub with booze and drugs in it, just to spite them. So yeah, it is that kind of it is true in politics, just like it's true in physics. Any action has an opposite and equally forceful reaction. So yeah, questions?
Yeah, if possible. First, what were the conditions that you were talking about to quit Romania?
To leave. Okay, so there were essentially 3 methods to leave de facto. Well, actually 4. The first one was you would become a decent enough officer in the state apparatus, in the Securitate, and then you could essentially defect. It's what Pacepa did. But that was the hard version. That was really difficult to do it, but it was doable. The second, least complicated, but also not accessible for everyone, was if you were a specific kind of minority. For instance, West Germany was paying the Romanian state to send to them any willing Saxon, old Saxon from Transylvania was willing to leave to Germany. The West German state would pay the Romanian state just so they can be allowed to leave. There's been about 100,000 Romanian citizens of German background who emigrated that way, especially in late 70s and early 1980s. So that was another version. So you could either be an ethnic minority, like Germans in particular, Jews as well. Israel paid for some of the Romanian citizens of Jewish background, but not all of them. Or there was the the program, again organized by the American Protestants, or I would say neo-Protestants, evangelicals and stuff, who would sponsor not just Romanians but neo-Protestants from any communist country. They would sponsor their moving to the United States. One of my best friends lives in the United States. He emigrated like that in 1979, perfectly legally. Although that particular version was a bit complicated, because if that particular neo-Protestant happened to be someone of relative importance, then you would live in a very dire circumstance. For instance, this friend that I'm talking about, he had his citizenship withdrawn. The state basically said, you're no longer a Romanian citizen, you have 10 days to leave the country or else. And yeah, they went to Austria, essentially asked for asylum to the United States there, and they were sponsored by the neo-Protestant movement there, and he's fine, and his whole family was fine, and he's an American citizen. But the thing is that if you weren't part of any of those minorities, then that option was not available for you. Then it was the third and the most common option. You would become something that was relevant, that allowed for short trips outside, which were legal. Football player, athletics, university professors who would go to various conferences and things like that. Orchestra conductors. Yes, Chilibadaki, yes. So things of that nature. And then you would go and, as we would say, forget to come back. So that worked for a while until the regime figured it out, and then it was suddenly forbidden to go into short trips if you wanted to go with your family. So no, you are an orchestra conductor, fine, you go, you have to go to the concert, it's a scheduled concert of course, but your son and wife stay here.
Like they do in Cuba today.
Like they do in Cuba today, yes, except that this was 35, 40 years ago, but yes, it's very similar. So yeah, that was the, and then it was the outright running away version, the fourth version, which took many forms. The most common of them that I'm aware of is going illegally to Yugoslavia, crossing the border illegally, and then there you would go to any Western embassy and ask for asylum, and they would send you to an asylum processing center, which were essentially sort of not really jails, because they had much better conditions, but they were essentially a bunch of jails operated by the Yugoslav state. And Josip Broz Tito didn't particularly care, because he was getting money from the UN for about $90 per day per inmate, for about 90 days per inmate, while the asylum request was being processed. So as a result, you would stay there for about 3 months, and then usually, almost always, the asylum request would be granted, and then from there you would usually be flown to Italy, and then from there either to the United States or any other non-communist country you had applied asylum to. So that was the version of outright running. But there were some more exotic versions. For instance, there is a case of a family in Arad, which is in the far west of the country, who got themselves access to a small-time airplane that was used to pour disinfectant on the fields, which is meant for very short flies. And they basically waited and calculated for a day when it was very strong wind from the east towards the west. And they took off right next from the border and landed 500 meters inside Austria, essentially. So they made it, yes. And they had to leave 2 of their children behind because they couldn't fit all of them into the plane, but they made it.
And the family was safe here, or there were?
They weren't, because they had become, even though they didn't necessarily want it to, eventually they did become out of their own volition, but at first they were considered dissidents, even though they weren't exactly. They just made them off-color comment during the workplace. As I said, anything you could say would be used against you sometime down the line, just because the regime can. And if you piss off the wrong person. Now, of course, there were exceptions to this, because it wasn't, people imagine it as a very rigid system. But as always, human nature is not rigid. So, as much as I don't like to admit it, communists are people too. So, so they weren't particularly rigid. There were people who were allowed, for various reasons, to do these kinds of things. I'm thinking here, for instance, it was forbidden for a man to wear long hair. But at the same time, there were about 100,000 men with long hair in the country. And they were some of them were just abusing the rules. For instance, they say, "Oh, I'm an actor. I played this particular character, which was long-haired, at the particular theater." But then they would play that character for like 5 years. So some of them were just abusing the rules, because that worked as well, because it was all paperwork, and you could just extend the papers as much as you want. But others were simply just, friends with one of the sons of the dictator, or friends with someone higher ups in the Securitate. So there were ways around it. That's another reason why it was bound to fail, because in public, if you asked 100 random people on the street, probably 98 of them would say that they follow the regime and whatnot. In reality, maybe 10 of them followed the regime. The rest, everyone else was looking consistently for ways to work around the regime and do whatever they wanted instead of it.
Sorry, one general question. You were talking about this kind of mistrust
Mm-hmm.
to the people.
Yes.
The first impression I have, I'll be here for 2 days, was if you talk to people and you ask something, they very friendly answer you, very maybe because they see you're not from here, I don't know. But what you can see or observe in the street or between the people seems quite peaceful. So.
Yeah, but we're 30 years after the events I'm describing.
Okay, but this is generation question, yes. So
yeah, they're friendlier than they used to be 30 years ago, but less friendly than they should be.
but what about and they seem to be proud if you tell, for example, I was surprised how beautiful Bucharest looks to me, at least the areas I've been to, the center and this area and so on. And so I talked to this to taxi or to drivers, and they were really feeling proud. You find this beautiful. This is nice to listen to.
This yes.
Because what I've seen from people who come from East Germany still today, they have a minority complex, because everything was put down, and they were they felt mistreated, not respected, and so like they told it was all shit what you've lived and what you've constructed here is all shit. And what about this kind of self-confidence and the people looking at themselves with a national but healthy national pride?
I understand your question. What you're describing is something that happened in the post-communist period, so after the regime fell. During the communist period, this is why it's very easy for Romanians who are of knowledge, it's very easy for us to accept that communism is just a version, communism and Nazism are not different to each other. And the reason it's easy is because our regime was essentially national communist. There was a lot of nationalist propaganda during the communist era in Romania, as opposed to Poland, for instance, where they had more internationalist type of flavor, and as opposed to Hungary, which again they had a more Soviet internationalist type of propaganda available. Ours was a bit more nationalist, and one of the reasons is because Ceausescu personally hated the Russians. So as a result, he was like, I'm going to build my own communism with blackjack and hookers, essentially. But what you're describing is true in the sense that after 1990, a lot of our post-communist elites have indeed put us, we basically did it to ourselves. We did put ourselves down, and we had, and to a certain extent it still exists, this kind of minority complex that you're talking about. Especially during the 90s, when it was true, it was this saying that, we're 50 years behind the West. And in 91, that was probably true. By 2001, it was probably not so much true. By 2011, it was definitely not true. But because the message was very present everywhere for about 15 years, until about 2005, 2006, it was very present everywhere that, we're so behind, we're just absolute and utter shit compared to the West. Because that message was there, again, 15 years of a message has an effect for about 30 years after it stops being played. So, the communist message stopped being played 30 years ago. Only now some of the commie era instincts are starting to die off. So, that particular message stopped being played about 12 or 13 years ago. It will probably still be around for another 12 or 13 years from this moment on. And yes, you're right. There are a lot of citizens of Romania who have a very dire impression about their own country. And oftentimes it's unaccounted for, in the sense that they shouldn't be having it. Sure, there are dysfunctional things in Romania. Oh, quite a lot of them, and don't get me started on that. But it's nowhere near as bad as people think. And the reason I'm starting to see this is because I've traveled in about 100 countries. I used to have that impression too. When I had only visited 2 or 3 countries, I had the same impression. But then when I exceeded 10 countries visited, I'm like, well, maybe it's a bit more complicated than that. When I exceeded 50 countries visited, I'm like, come on, it's, okay, Romania is not the best country in the world, but it's definitely nowhere near the worst. It's probably much better than the worst. And when I exceeded 70 countries visited, I came to the definitive conclusion that, this country is probably in the top 40 of 197 countries that are in the world. We're probably in the top 40, maybe 35, maybe 31, somewhere there. So we're definitely not the best in the world, but we're definitely not utter shit. But I've come to this conclusion after many years of traveling, many years of studying. But most of the people, of course, they don't have the time to do that. They don't have the inclination to do this. Most people are not men of knowledge, and that's okay. So as a result, they take what the mainstream has been telling them. And as I told you, between 1990 and until about 2005, 2006, this was the message. That we're absolute shit, and we might recover economically with the West in maybe 100 years, when in reality it took about 20, even less than that in some respect. I mean, Bucharest now is above the EU average in terms of standard of living, for instance. So, it's not a bad place to live. Sure, I have my own comments about it, and I don't particularly like this city. It's the only city in Romania that I really don't like. But nevertheless, if I had to choose between living here and Havana, of course, here is better. So yeah, but the minority complex is something that has affected all over the Interbarium in particular, so Eastern Europe, not Russia necessarily, but Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, and so on. So the Interbarium region, minority complex has been there for a while, and to a certain extent it still is there in certain Interbarium countries. I'm thinking here about Albania, for instance, where almost everyone thinks that their country is the shittiest on earth, when in reality it really isn't. Because when I went to Albania, I'm like, look, this place has been worse than North Korea until 1991. So looking from that perspective, anywhere you go in Albania, like, this is amazing. I mean, in just 27 years, they almost caught up with the rest of Europe. Sure, there are still dysfunctional things. Sure, economically they're still lagging behind. But it's one thing to be 20% less than and being 120% less than. In my opinion, the difference matters. But yes, you are correct in identifying the minority complex. That still is a thing, especially with older people, but with many young people as well, especially young people who, and this is a fault of us as Romanians. I haven't seen it in Poland, for instance, but I've seen it's very common here. People who go to study in Western Europe, and they get indoctrinated with very far left ideas that are very common in Western universities, and then they come and judge Romania by far left Western standards. And yes, by those standards, Romania falls very short, of course, because we're very intolerant. That is to say, we would prefer our streets not to be full of certain members of a certain religion who tend to blow themselves up. Yeah, we're very intolerant in that respect. So when judged by those standards, yes, we fall short on it. One thing that I do admire about the Polish young people is that they went to the West to work or to study or whatever, and they compared the West with what Poland is today, rather than some ideal standard or with Poland in the 1990s, and which is of course a more honest comparison. So when you compare the Poland of 2009, just yesterday I was still in Poland, and Paris of 2019, Warsaw is preferable. There's no question about it. Or Berlin. I've been to Berlin in May this year, and until yesterday I was in Warsaw. Warsaw is just better in all respects. There's nothing to compare. There's just nothing to compare. So when you make honest comparison, you end up with the conclusion that, look, things are not so bad. Sure, we're far from perfect. Nobody is perfect. There is no such thing as perfect country. And sure, there are things we're still worse off than the West, but there's nowhere near as bad as people think. And this will take at least another decade from now on to be healed. Healing at the civilizational scale takes at least 2 generations. That's what I found through my study. This is true in the case of, let's take a more older example, the unification of Italy. After the unification of Italy, I forget the name of the general who said it, but it says essentially, l'Italia sa facere, sto facere gli italiani. Italy has been made, now we have to make Italians. And this was 100 years ago, in 1918. Only now, about 10 years ago, you finally see people who identify first with Italy. And they say, look, I'm a proud Italian. This was not the case 50 years ago. Or 20 years ago, really.
Now we have this as in Italy. I live in Italy, and they have
They're still Lombardians and Romans, and yes, absolutely, yes.
the Sicilians,
Well, Sicily has always been its own thing, so. But
the
you know,
Napolitans.
yes, they're very yes.
And they are very hostile with the other regions, even more than with
Foreigners, yes. I've been treated better in Naples, in Napoli, than someone coming from Lombardy, because I'm a non-Napolitan as well. But you're from Romania, distant Roman Empire. Okay, fine. But that guy is from Lombardy. That guy is terrible. Yeah, that's true. Sorry, it wasn't that you. But you get the point. So yes, but it took 70, 80 years until that wound of unification was somewhat healed. And it's still not completely healed, and the scar will stay there for at least another 150 years for sure. And it's the same with all of these kinds of historical wounds. It takes time for them to heal. And yes, some of them are so deep that they never get healed.
I know as a German.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Even that's definitely true in Germany as well. Many historical wounds are still very open.
So I'm the first generation after Second World War, because my parents grew up in Second World War. And I'm carrying all this feeling of guilt and of not processed wounds, and the feeling of guilt of my parents that they have been part of this.
Even though what age they were? 10, 11 during the war?
My father was nearly 16, and my mother was 8. She lived in Poland area. I had to flee from the Russians. My father was going to the frontier as one of the youngsters who still were brought in the last days of the war to fight against the Russians. But luckily, a few hours before they got to meet the Russian front, there comes in news that Germany had capitulated. And even though a lot of officers let their troops still fight and kill all the youngsters, and the officer of my father's troop luckily was the one who said, take your buddy, run home, take your clothes, your uniforms off, hide them or burn them, and good luck for you. And just away. So luckily probably there's nothing happened.
Yeah, again, there's nothing for them to be guilty of, because they
but
were
my
kids.
father still 85, he was studying his whole life about Third Reich, what happened, why he was as a youngster fascinated, and he was adapting to it because he was trained in it. And he never got over it, this feeling, this deep.
There is this theory which I find it fascinating. I'm not so sure about its validity. I've seen empirical, as in anecdotal evidence of it, but I'm still not sure what to make of it. But it seems to be pretty consistent, namely that youngsters tend to be fascinated by revolutionary thought. And National Socialism was a revolutionary ideology, just like International Socialism is, and just like Robespierre's, fascism, or actually standard fascism of Benito Mussolini was slightly less revolutionary than the German version. As always, when the Germans take something from someone else, they make it bigger and stronger. No offense intended, but it's true. I mean, so of course, when you're 14, you're attracted to a lot of fucked up shit. And this is true today as well. How many 14-year-olds you can find them on Twitter, LARPing either as Antifas or as kings, or it's just the stories we tell to ourselves. And between that period, and I'm sure you know a lot of this because you studied with Professor Gugu as well, but between the period of late pre-puberty, so between the ages of 9 and full adulthood around 15 or 16, that's a very turbulent period, especially for young boys, young men.
It's a revolution and against everything.
Yes, and that's the period when one, it's true for girls as well, but to a lesser extent than for boys for sure. But it's the period when you're attracted the most to revolutionary thought. That's the period when parents matter the most. There is this mythology that parenting matters the most in the first 2 years. Actually, it would be better if we would focus between the ages of 9 and 15, because that's where the personality is being formed. And usually the mistakes committed by parents when the kid is 10 usually remain with that individual, with the kid, for the rest of his life. Whereas a mistake committed when the kid is 2, the kid will never remember it. No one cares. It's a lot less bad than early teenage years. Essentially, is what I mean. So yeah, I suspect this is one of the reasons why your father was attracted to, because he was just in the right age bracket when revolutionary thought sounds awesome.
No, it was sold like the Boy Scouts, It was adventure. And it was, yes, we are right, we are a group, there's a common enemy, we have to stand for our country, all this feeling, of course.
Yes, and I don't think that can be changed, except with more stable families and with qualitative parents, essentially. Just have parents be a little bit more concerned with things that matter rather than things that don't matter. One example that I really like to give, and I always trigger people when I give it, is that when parents are very concerned whether their 14-year-old son is smoking or not. And I'm like, are you insane? Let the kid smoke in front of you and be more concerned with what thoughts he's entertaining. Because that's a lot more complicated, because ideas have long-term and permanent consequences. Smoking, not so much. Professor de Carvalho is a very good example of maybe smoking is good. I'm just saying. I'm only half joking, but seriously, attention to thoughts is probably more important. Please.
Professor Olavo says that there's a similarity between Romanian and Brazilian people.
And he's probably right on that.
As peripheral nations that looks towards the social geopolitical developments in a position that gives us the opportunity to look at them in a more privileged way and
in a more what?
Objective
way. Okay.
Do you agree?
I don't think it's necessarily more objective, but it's for sure more cold-hearted. Because from a Romanian perspective, and I'm sure it's true from a Brazilian perspective as well, the Germans and French are fighting again with each other. What else is new? So from our perspective, it's not something of a sense of an emergency, because we're like, again, really? We've seen that movie from a civilizational perspective. We've seen that movie played out several times. So as a result, there's nothing to. We don't feel it as a sense of emergency the way the Netherlands, for instance, would look at, because they're sandwiched between them. So they're like, shit, these guys are at it again. That means consequences directly on our streets within the next week. Whereas for us, it's like, there will be consequences for us too, first of all economics, and then maybe on our streets if the war lasts long enough, but that's years from now. Okay, let's gather some military, let's get prepared. So yeah, in that perspective, I think it's true. But generally, whether it's more objective or not, I don't know. I don't think so. Because we're still people, and people are...
Because I can see, sorry, just to conclude, I can see that you have a very remarkable flexibility. You are always traveling, as you say. You visit 100 of countries, and I don't know from now on a French agitator, as you say, that travels that much, that talks that much, that is agitating that much.
I presume that this is because you gave the example of the French. France has seen itself as the center of the world for so long. And they still haven't accepted the fact that they're not the center of the cultural world anymore. They used to be, for sure, but they're not at this point. So, as a result, it's very likely for a French Lucien Vulsan to emerge. Because from a civilizational perspective, every child inherits the idea that France is the center of the world, so everyone else should be looking up to us. Whereas we come from the perspective that, look, we're not the center of the world, we never have been the center of the world, so it is on us to start seeing the world, understand the world, and then have opinions about it. That, of course, if you apply a rigorous standard on your knowledge, of course there are many people, not just in this country, but all over Europe, who have the impression that they know everything about everything, and they have barely left their neighborhood, but they have opinions about everything. I just prefer not to be one of those people. Please, by all means.
I was just asking, coming back to this question of the importance of the parents on the children, especially in this age, what makes it very difficult today is that the influence is so splitted and so
split between what and what?
Between home and between influence of school, between of the
wider culture
left narratives. With all vegan, you don't eat food, it has to be the climate change and everything that comes up, even as a youngster at the school. And and all this technological influences you can't even oversee as an adult. So you're not knowing your son is going to the neighbor's house and what kind of games they're playing, what they're doing, or if he goes to computer. Because I didn't grow up, I'm not a digital generation, so I can't really, I have to force myself incredibly to try to control it to a certain point. What influences he get, what kind of games, Fortnite, if he does as a download or not. So there are a lot of influences, the generational gap is enormous.
Yeah, there is this generalized feeling that the generational gap between those of us not digital kids and the next generation after us, there is this feeling that is enormous. I'm not convinced that is significantly bigger than the historical norm, because old farts have been complaining about those revolutionary youths since the times of Plato. Plato has a rant about how the youths are fucking terrible and they're gonna ruin everything, and they didn't. One has to be very careful at the record of history at the civilizational scale when making such statements, because it can be true, but likely it's not.
I think yes, because I see it every day. I'm a teacher in school, and I
with
teach
schools
for 20 years, and I see a changing of light speed of behavior and of
with schools
capacities and of interests and of fascination. You talk to them to Timbuktu about Timbuktu or Zanzibar, and there's nothing doing click, like nothing fascination, exotic, nothing like, wow, I would love to go there, or the old explorers, and nothing kept their interest.
You're
so this is a gap that's tremendous.
Yeah, you're correct. I'm just saying that I don't know if it's necessarily bigger than the historical norm. There have been in the past generations, or one or two generations in a row, that had very little desire for exploring, had very little desire for things. Usually, however, and that's the sad news, usually after two of those generations, that particular civilization collapses. So there's not good news ahead in that direction. Now, again, there's nothing we can do about that. But we can do changes in our own lives. Practice liberty as a lifestyle choice, as I usually say in my videos. There are things that I'm not buying the notion that it is impossible to control or it is impossible to do. I'm not buying that notion. I work in technology and I don't have a smartphone, and I'm a very discreet man. And I only allow things to appear in public whenever I say so and how much I say so. And if I can do it even as working within the tech industry, I'm not buying the notion that for other people it is impossible. No, it's not. The one thing that has to be done first is just don't give your children smartphones, and generally don't own smartphones yourselves. I'm just saying, it's terrible. Yes, you're getting a bit of convenience, but at a terrible cost. People think only at the financial cost. A smartphone is a lot more expensive than a normal phone. But it's not just the financial cost, it's the cost in privacy, it's the cost in attention span that you brought up, and you're absolutely correct about that. The attention span is a terrible issue.
So our older boy has no smartphone, he's not getting one so soon, maybe with 16, maybe.
Yeah, that's a more, yes.
Because he's 11 now, and we think it's an age where you're building up so many things, and you just have to do it by experiencing things in another way than this. Mirror, you can't build up, for example, empathy by screens.
Yeah, that's absolutely
impossible. You can just build up empathy by dealing with real people, real things, animals, plants, whatever, and not in front of this. And so he has to learn a lot and to interiorize a lot of real life experience before he maybe can in a certain way step securely this certain kind of gap between reality and digital.
Yeah.
So, but then he gets problems, of course, and a lot of people, we have a lot of colleagues. That's why most parents give smartphones to their kids. Of course, it's easier. They're busy. In a certain way, it's easier. They are occupied. And the other kids all have one, so always the same conversation. So he's not isolated and whatever.
Yeah.
There are other ways of communicating, whatever.
You're correct.
But we're not running down this. So
this thing with isolated is something that I was never able to understand. I still don't understand that argument with isolation. I mean, I love it when I'm alone. I get to think about stuff. I get to read more stuff without anyone bothering me. That's awesome. Are you kidding me? Can you isolate me a little bit more, please? So I was never able to empathize with the argument of isolation. That's one aspect. So I can't speak to that because I don't understand it, and I don't pretend to, and I will probably never understand it. But the peer pressure is indeed a serious issue. But that's where strength of character of the parents comes in. Just have the strength of character to not just tell your child no, which you should have anyway. If you can't tell your child no, then you're a terrible parent. But have the strength of character to tell that to other parents and to other children of your neighborhood. No, that's terrible for you. And in time, people underestimate how much influence they can have as individuals. Just one individual saying no in a collective of 20 people, that can have a tremendous influence oftentimes. Sure, not always. You're not going to always win the argument. You're not always going to convince the peer group that you're right. But it's more than zero. It's more than a quarter of time. It's about half of times in my experience. Just saying no, that's it. It's the hardest word, even though it's the easiest word to pronounce. It's the hardest word to say, no. And saying no tends to help. And it's not just with smartphones. It's also, but this again comes down to the strength of character of parents. How many parents today have a full bookshelf? Very few of them, because everyone.
How many parents, sorry?
Have a bookshelf. Yes, so having at least 100 books in your house, preferably 10,000 in my opinion. But okay, having a bookshelf in your house tends to help, because that's how you raise the curiosity of the kid. And of course, patience, because I've seen a lot of parents being concerned that their 12-year-old is not reading as much as they used to be. And I'm like, I started reading when I was 17. I was uninterested in knowledge and wisdom until 17. Because, there were more interesting stuff, so like playing football. That was awesome. Going to concert. Girls, of course, there are a lot of things more awesome. Yep. And about the age of 17, I was like, oh, okay, let's pick up a book. Oh, this is interesting. Let's pick another one. Books. So, I mean, patience is a very important factor. And because this is the age of less patience, of short attention spans, as you have correctly identified, the struggles are different for sure. And for those who have lived long enough, they may appear even more difficult than in the past. But I'm not convinced that they're necessarily more difficult. They're certainly different, but I'm not convinced they're necessarily more difficult. I mean, think about it. In the 50s, what were the concerns? What if he in the forests eats something that is poisoned and dies in the forest without me even knowing it? What if he gets involved with a street gang? You didn't have a cell phone, you couldn't call, you had no idea where your kid is, and you would be out during vacation time, when there was no school. They would be out at 9 or 10 a.m. and come back at 6 p.m. when dark sets in. You had no idea of course, you had the trust in the community, which was much higher than it is now for sure. But still, there were other types of concerns. I would argue at least equally difficult to those of today. They were just fundamentally different. Today, the concern should be, in my opinion, what does your child read on the internet and what does he understand of it? Because that's probably the more important stuff, because the 9-year-old son of the person with whom I'm making the Romanian language podcast on the Romanian language channel, he gets to read a lot of weird stuff. And of course he looks at the podcasts with his father and me, and then he starts Googling those terms that we use there. Sometimes we use very complex terms, and the kids gets stuck in a Wikipedia loop reading about fascism and genocide and common graves, and then he comes back and asks, okay, so, but why did they do that? Because the article didn't explain, and then we start explaining to him and whatnot. Focusing on what he understands from what he reads is probably more important than necessarily what he reads. I mean, I've seen many left-wing parents who are like, oh, he shouldn't be reading about that, and I'm like, no. Let's entertain all the dangerous ideas. Why are you so afraid of ideas? Afraid they might be losing? And it's true. I mean, many left-wing parents are complaining that they're losing their children to a far-right bubble, because 16-year-olds are starting to read on the internet, and they stumble upon various YouTube channels. There are about 1 million of them in all languages of Earth, discussing countercultural ideas. And the kids spend enough time learning and reading, and they come up with the conclusion that maybe my parents aren't as smart as I thought they would be. Or as Professor Gugu would put it, when you're as a boy, when you reach 16, 17, 18, you're no longer physically afraid of your father. You're just another guy. Yeah, sure, you're a bit older, but you're just another guy. And at that point, it becomes much easier to have the courage to tell your father, Dad, you're wrong. I'm sorry, but you're wrong. And that's why many left-wing parents are complaining that the internet should be given to children, not necessarily in a managed way, but with the wisdom associated with a physical parent being present. But we shouldn't undermine generally the access of the children to the internet, because the internet has been a very good tool. I mean, the reason we're here is because of the internet. I mean, he found my YouTube channel, you guys met each other on social media, and now here we are somewhere in Bucharest talking about complicated ideas and sometimes not so complicated.
On that matter, do you have an opinion on unschooling?
Unschooling. I have read about that. I'm due to meet probably this December, I hope, if not next year in February, a family, actually two families, two mothers and two fathers of kids from here, from Bucharest, who are into this, their children are unschooled. So I will reserve forming an opinion upon meeting them, because I don't know all of I don't understand all of the details. I understand how homeschooling works, and I understand how communal school works. I understand that unschooling is somewhere between these two, but to which degree, and many of the details are still unclear to me.
I would say no. I would say it's a even more radical notion of education, which is not even a homeschooling, not even the communal schooling, but it's even more radical than those.
Yeah, it is essentially says that it allows a much higher degree of random than homeschooling or communal schools. That's the shortest version. Yeah. But the thing is that to what degree, how does it work? I want to meet a few cases of kids who have been unschooled. So in order to form an opinion, I presume it could work. My biases tend to tell me that it's probably workable for some children. I don't think it is necessarily a solution for the masses. I mean, I understand for people like us, it would probably be a good solution. In the sense that I trust myself a lot more than the Marxist professor down the street. And let me teach my kid. I'll probably teach him better. Better mathematics, better Romanian language, better 3 other languages, better chemistry, better physics, for sure. At least up to the level of the 8th grade, for sure. I'll be better than the public school teacher down the street. So maybe it is a solution for parents of very high level of knowledge and wisdom, but I'm not convinced that is necessarily a good solution. Dare I buy a Leninist term, for the masses, in the sense that we have to understand that people are not equal. They're not equal in anything. They're not equal in height, they're not equal in strength, they're not equal in intelligence, they're not equal in ability to play chess, in ability to run, and so on and so forth. And
for sure it shouldn't be a kind of revolutionary solution for all people.
Yeah, I presume he was asking me what I think about this alternative in particular, right? Again, after I meet the cases, I'll probably have a more firm opinion on it. But from what I know now, it sounds like a reasonable option for parents of knowledge. But not necessarily an option for everyone else. Sadly, what I have read so far is that at least one of the families that I'm due to meet, and that's why I'm avoiding telling their names and whatnot, because I don't want them to bail on my interview, is one of them is the parents are basically corporate hipsters. Who are very convinced that they're people of knowledge, and I'm very convinced that they're not. So that's why I'm a bit careful about having definitive opinions about this until I meet these people, because I could be wrong. I don't think I'm wrong, but I could be wrong, and I want to give them a chance to prove me wrong, and maybe gather a little bit more knowledge on the topic in order to form an opinion on it. It could be a good idea, but generally I'll prefer more established traits. Although, of course, in Germany that's difficult, because homeschooling is not just illegal, but strictly and rigidly enforced. Any attempt to that. I mean, there have been cases of German citizens asking and receiving asylum during Obama years, because the authorities wanted to put them in jail and take away their children because they don't believe in the public school system. So yeah, in Germany it's probably the worst case. Yes, absolutely, yes. There was a horrible case, I remember reading about it in 16, I think, in Darmstadt. I remember the locality, Darmstadt, where the Bundespolizei came in like with the SWAT team to take away 5 children and put the parents in jail and their horrible crime was just to say, you know what, for a year we're not going to send our kids to school, they're going to learn at home. And apparently that's absolutely haram in the Deutsches Bundesrepublik, and that's kind of terrible. But Germany is a special case in this respect. All of the other countries of Europe have various legal ways of getting your own way as a parent if you want to. For instance, in Romania, the most popular version is to sign up legally to an umbrella school that is located in Spain. And because, you know, there is such thing as the European Union, so as a result, any degree issued in Spain has to be recognized here and vice versa. So they sign up to that particular school, which bills itself as an online school, but in reality what they do is they send you the material, and they have material in almost all languages of the European Union, and you study at your own pace, and then you give an exam identical with any Spanish student in the public school system, and you know, those are then mutually recognizable between the countries. But in reality, the kid never sees the interior of a school unless he wants to or whatever. But generally, that's how homeschooling is being done here, as an absolute standard. There are other versions, but this one is the most common because it's easy.
I would like to ask you, continuing this question of family and parenthood, I remember an essay that I read some years ago by Joseph Brodsky, the Russian poet. It's called Less Than One, in which he explained about his childhood in Russia, in Soviet Union, and on how this problem of trust was, especially in Russia, was so strong that even he cites a case of a guy that in the school denounced his father to the teacher, and his father goes to a concentration gulag to die there. And in Romania,
there were a few cases like that in Russia.
Also,
yes,
you had these problems also in not in family, but in the more strict family, father, son, mother.
I'm not familiar
These
with...
relations were mined also in Romania.
Tell something before you answer. My granddaughter was very mean, very happy and mean, saying, I can put my parents in jail if they don't treat me well. And asked me, do you want to go to a orphanage? And then she, and then I had to talk to her.
Yes, I'm not familiar of any case, at least not after 1967. Before 1960, there is the period between 1948 and 1967, which is very difficult to ascertain, because that was the period when commies didn't keep accurate records. Ceausescu at least brought the accurate records keeping practice. Until then, but I'm not familiar with any case in Romania where a child denounced his parents. Uncles, brothers, but adults with each other, yes, there have been a few cases like that. But the children to denounce their parents, I'm not familiar with any. There might have been one somewhere and I haven't heard of it, maybe, but I don't think there were. Keep in mind that in the Soviet Union, as huge of a country as it was, there were only about 4 or 5 cases in 100 years. There weren't that many in Soviet Russia either. That's why we know about them, because the regime made sure to proselytize those particular cases. I mean, one of the children who denounced their parents to the party officials, there were streets named after the kid, and the kid was honored in public. Often he was given a free and cushy job in the state apparatus and whatever. Not because they cared necessarily about the kid in particular, but it forwarded the narrative that the Soviet state is so perfect that it transcends family boundaries and all the rest. It was very propagandistically useful, as I usually say in my videos. Something is propagandistically useful, you're going to blow it out of proportion because it's propagandistically useful. So even in Soviet Russia, there weren't that many of them. It's 4 or 5 cases documented. And even today, there are movies made after those cases because there are so few of them. And so yeah, it wasn't that particularly common. Of course, the regime believed it to be desirable to have such cases because they're propagandistically useful. But in reality, they didn't happen that often because, you know, kids are kids, and at the end of the day, as you said, you want to go to the orphanage? Well, I don't know, because everyone knew what the orphanages looked like, and nobody really wanted to be there. And so they weren't particularly common. In fact, this kind of attitude that you have described,
this was months ago.
That's what I'm saying. It's a lot more common today than it was during communism. Not here necessarily in Romania, but it's very common, for instance, in Norway, in Sweden. Where?
Portugal.
Okay, where is that?
Portugal is the face of Europe facing America.
Okay, yes. So it's very common, but I'm more familiar with Scandinavia on this one because I've helped a human rights lawyer there to make the case against the Norwegian Child Protective Services, the Barnevernet. So that's why I'm familiar. It's very common today because today is again, especially in Scandinavia, to a certain extent the rest of Europe too, but Scandinavia is way out there in a way. There is this idea that the young people can be whatever they want, when in reality that's a lie. You can't be whatever you want because you might want to be an astronaut and you have asthma. Tough, you can't be an astronaut. So, but there is this idea, and there is this idea that of course the old your parents are passé as people because they're old, they are stuck in their old ways. We got a bright new tomorrow to build together as young people. So as a result, this kind of attitude is a lot more common today, I'm afraid, than it was during Soviet Russia. Especially, it's definitely true in Scandinavia, because in Scandinavia there have been cases, some of them really, really weird. Let's say the Barnevernet, these child protective services, came in and took the child of a family for economical mistreatment. What was the crime? The cat of the family had peed on the carpet in which in the room in which the child was living, but the cat peed 2 years before the child was born. Shit, literally. Yeah, this is a very legit case. You can find documents about it on the website of the European Court of Human Rights. Norway lost that case, obviously. I mean, even the European Court of Human Rights was like, come on, guys, that's insane. And there have been.
What was the problem of the cat to pee 2 years before?
Well, apparently it's unhealthy for a child to live in a room in which an animal peed.
Abandoned.
It doesn't matter that the animal peed 2 years before the child was even born, so plenty of time to replace the floor altogether and build a new house. Goddammit!
And you didn't go to IKEA to buy.
Yeah,
No,
true.
this is like abandoning or not doing the service of being treating well the child in the health environment. That is probably the main argument.
Yes, as I said, it's considered not healthy for a child to.
How did they know about it?
As far as I know, a neighbor ratted them in. If I remember correctly, it's about 1,000 pages in Norwegian, so it's a lot of reading to do too. But if I recall correctly, a neighbor ratted them in. So yeah. Just like in Germany, it's very common for the neighbor to rat you into the Finanzamt, what's it called? Because you have a too fancy car. How can you afford that? Maybe you're bailing on taxes. Oh my God, people don't want to pay theft. I mean taxes. So yeah, this is very common as well in Scandinavia, particularly in Norway, where you don't even have to have. Again, just like in our times in 1980s Romania with the Securitate. It's enough if one neighbor in a whole neighborhood is this kind of knows it all and wants to do good by the force of the state. He thinks that he has ideas so good that they have to be mandatory. It's enough if one of them knows that and goes and files a report. It doesn't have to be all of the community. And there have been the reason the Barnevernet issue became a little bit more known outside of Norway is because there have been several very fucked up cases of families that were mixed. One parent was Norwegian and the other parent was an immigrant, either Czech. There was a case with the Romanians. There were several cases with Polish parents, and the same rules applied. And I'm very familiar, of course, with the Romanian one. It was called the Bodnariu case, in which they basically alleged that the children are being physically and psychologically abused. How did they come up to that conclusion? Where the children believed in God, and that's terrible. Religion is terrible according to the secular state of Norway. And it's not that like they were part of some whatever sect. No, they were part of a very mainstream branch of Christianity that has about 15% of Norway belongs to that particular branch of it. It's not something marginal or whatever or radical in any way, shape or form. But the children believed in God, and one of them drew how he imagined heaven to look like and God to look like during a plastics class, during drawing class. And one of the professors, the teachers, thought that that's a sign of alarm and called the Bar de Vernet to investigate. And during the investigation, the children were separated and sent to various foster care families. And luckily for the kids, the parents were very well connected within the global Protestant movement, and they made a huge ruckus about it. There were protests against Norway in front of the embassies of Norway in like 55 or 60 capital cities in the world. They made a huge ruckus out of it. They had the BBC publish hit pieces on the Norwegian government. They sued Norway to the European Court of Human Rights. Eventually, they got their kids back, but how many other cases, and I know the answer to that question, but most people don't know how many other cases just like this one, or even worse than this one, even more absurd than this one, have been around in the last 20 years since the Bar de Vernet, well actually more, 28 years, it was founded in 1991, since the Bar de Vernet was founded. And I know the answer, there are several hundreds. And nobody seems to care, because Norway, again, peripheral nation, who cares? But the thing is that between 5 and 7% of all children born in Norway have at some point been under investigation by the Bar de Vernet. That's a little bit more than the Soviet Union era. The Soviet Union Internal Affairs Directorate that was dealing with these kinds of surveilling families, it is alleged that they surveilled about 4% of children. So Bar de Vernet is a little bit worse than that. Now, admittedly, they don't send people to the Gulag, so in that respect they're better. But in terms of actual surveillance and in terms of this kind of direct state abuse upon families, it's pretty bad. Yeah. So yeah.
Can you tell us about you mentioned that there was Ceausescu who tried to stay a bit independent of the Soviet Union. At which degree this independence arrived? How the Romanian system was dependent on the Soviet Union?
Probably the most obvious sign of independence, you can still see it today, very few people speak Russian. Like nobody. The only Romanian citizens that speak Russian are those that are born in the Republic of Moldova, so they're literally born in the Soviet Union. But they had, of course, parents in the Greater Romania, and they could acquire citizenship, but not acquire, but get their citizenship back that was taken away from them during the Soviet times. But how many people born inside mainland Romania actually speak Russian? There aren't that many of them. Whereas in Hungary it was a bit more common, and in Poland it's very common to this day. You can get along in Russian pretty well in the Polish big cities, even though Poland as a state today is probably the most anti-Russian state in the European Union. But still, the level of influence that GDR as well, Russian was a mandatory language in schools, and this wasn't the case at all in Romania. I learned English and French. My father learned English and French. Russian, you could study Russian if you really wanted to, but it was not mandatory, and in many areas it was de facto impossible to study because there weren't that many teachers. The emphasis on the Russian language just outright vanished. So there wasn't much Russian language, there wasn't much Russian literature being translated or being imported, no Russian TV. So the cultural front, the Russian influence was, well, not zero, but very close to zero. So that's the most obvious area of independence. Now, with that being said, on other issues, the level of independence was in reality much lower than asserted in public. On one hand, the Romanian state was sponsoring the exact same bunch of loons that the Soviet state was sponsoring. So, for instance, Yasser Arafat, the quote-unquote Palestinian terrorist, he did his military service here. Like literally here, very close to where we are. And the Ceausescu era government was a big supporter of the what was later on to become Hamas. Same thing with the Iranian revolution, which was supported by the communist regime of Romania, and Romania was one of the first countries to open an embassy in the newly created Islamic Republic of Iran. Not to mention the friendliness of Ceausescu with various African dictators, like Robert Mugabe would be the most obvious example. They were really close friends. And Muammar al-Gaddafi of Libya as well. But at the very least, you could leave from al-Gaddafi's Libya, and we can argue that al-Gaddafi's regime in Libya was probably the least bad of all of them. But the Mugabe regime is the one that engineered the state-sponsored famine, just like ours. Well, actually, I would argue worse. I've just been to Zimbabwe and I've seen some effects, and it was worse than what we had. But still, so yeah, the independence was a lot less obvious in international relations, considering that the communist government of Romania was supporting almost the same causes as the Soviet Union, and oftentimes foreign what's called foreign counterintelligence operatives, the Securitate operatives who were operating abroad. It was called DIE, the pacepa word for it, the Directorate of External Intelligence, Direcția de Informații Externe. They would routinely collaborate on the field with the KGB. So in that direction, the level of independence was much lower than proclaimed in public. Now, the whole mythology of independence from Russia started in 1967, a few months after Ceausescu ascended to power, because there was the issue of invasion of Czechoslovakia. And as I'm sure you all know, Romania was the only Warsaw Pact country who said, no, we're not going to invade Czechoslovakia. And Ceausescu's reasoning was, well, for the public, he said, look, between communists, there shouldn't be military animus. That was his argument that he put forth to the public. In reality, the argument was like, I just fucking hate Russians. I mean, he personally didn't like Russians.
And why?
Why? Oh, well, that's simple, because he was Romanian. No, that's easy. Now, you have to understand, our animus towards Russia starts in like the 1720s. We've been at war with Russia for about 300 years now. Whether it was called Tsarist Russia, Soviet Union, Russian Federation, whatever, Knyazat, and it doesn't matter. We've been at war with those people for quite some time. Why? Because the geopolitical entity that occupies what is now called Russia has always been bent on expanding westwards. So,
it's not the case of Poland also?
Yes, of course. Well, up until the end of the Second World War, we and Poland were neighbors. Then with the emergence of modern-day Ukraine, now we're technically not neighbors anymore, but it's very close from our northwesternmost tip, and the southeasternmost tip of Poland is very close to get to Poland like that. But we used to be neighbors. I went last year to visit the old border crossing between Romania and Poland. Now both sides are in Ukraine. But in any way, yes, it is very similar with the case of Poland. We've been at war with Russia for some time. Sometimes it's a cold war, sometimes it's a warm war, sometimes it's we give each other silent treatment. But there are very few people in Romania, at least in the last 250 years, who could honestly say they love Russians.
Okay. And why do you speak Russian so well?
Because Russian is a useful language. It is.
But how did you learn it in school?
Oh no, I think I told the story only to some of you. Yes, my grandfather was a World War II veteran, so he spoke German and Russian because those were the useful languages in his time. He tried really hard to teach me German and Russian. He failed miserably at German, but he was very successful with the Russian language. So that's how I learned the Russian language. And it's a very useful language. I mean, it's one of the few, sometimes I like to joke about it because during kindergarten, the state was forcing us kids to sing a very stupid song, actually. And it wasn't the state, really. It was just that particular educator who was one of the few legit believers in Soviet communism. They were very rare, even in those times, especially in Romania, very rare. But that particular individual, an old lady, she was old then, I hope she died. A painful death, preferably. In any event, she was forcing us to sing a very stupid song that I've still been unable to find it to this day on the internet. I just want to hear it one more time, sung by someone else, because I forgot most of the lyrics. But the chorus was, the Russian language is a treasure. today, after decades of traveling and noticing in practice how useful the Russian language can be, I'm half joking to myself. Yep, the Russian language is a fucking treasure. I don't like to admit it. I'm not a big. I've never been a big fan of the Russian people, although I kind of loved Pushkin. But on a more serious note, I've never been a fan of the Russian civilization, and the alphabet is the easiest part. The grammar is the worst part, trust me. The alphabet is easy. I mean, it took me about a day to learn it. Admittedly, I was 6. You learn faster foreign languages at the age of 6, but it's not difficult. It's not the alphabet. No, the alphabet is the easiest part. The grammar is the worst. In any event, so yeah, and because the Soviet Union conquered so many other nations, of course, to this day, Russian is very useful when you go to the Caucasus. I want to go to Central Asia, which of course I'm going to have to handle myself in Russian there, because even though none of those states today are pro-Russian, they're definitely anti-Russian. The people over there, they have to admit it, that look, the only way for us to do business with the outside world is through the Russian language, because you can't get a country as huge as Kazakhstan, for instance, all of them to learn English overnight, because that's the language of business. No, for them, the language of business remains Russian, at least for another generation. Same thing in Georgia. I've noticed in 2017 when I went to Georgia, which to this day is in hot war with Russia. They have areas within the middle of Georgia, Ossetia and Abkhazia, which are under occupation by Putin's regime. This was just now. I mean, it's very recent stuff. Still, most people, even though they don't like it, in Georgia you can get to hear someone explaining to you in impeccable Russian why Russia shouldn't exist. I'm serious about it. So the thing is that they're the same. They told me the same thing. Look, we grew up speaking Russian. That was our foreign language. Whenever we were supposed to speak not in Georgian, it was Russian. That was the foreign language, just like how for me English is the foreign language. So, yeah, maybe our children will learn English, and yeah, it's already noticeable when you go on the streets of Tbilisi. If you go into the more youth-oriented area, there you can find either youths who speak both English and Russian, or who speak only English. But it's still very rare. 20, 30 years from now, they're probably going to switch to English or to something else, who knows?
Do you have questions from those who haven't spoken here?
One question. First time I've been here in Bucharest, I've been on the communist blocks, and the sensation the blocks gives to you is like you're trapped, and all neighbors are next to you, and you're really inside open jail. And also the architecture of Ceausescu, the parliament,
that's terrible.
Is the second biggest government building in the world.
Yes.
So could you tell us about the architecture of the communist area?
First of all, yes, I'm not very good to speak about architecture. I don't know everything about everything, but I know about the communist blocks. First of all, they're not an invention of the communists. It was an invention by a Swiss architect. And yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
That was the master of Nehemiah.
Yes, and the first implementation of the communist blocks wasn't in Soviet Union or Romania, it was in Sweden. Not even in Switzerland. Nobody in Switzerland wanted any of that. So he went and convinced the communists, yes, the left in Sweden, to implement, and they did. And then Stalin saw them and said, oh, that looks cute, and made them slightly bigger, and made them in Russia, in the Soviet Union. But the thing is that, as always the case with communism, we eventually run out of other people's money. So some of the buildings remained unfinished because they couldn't afford to finish them. And then when Ceausescu decided to build we have to remember this decision came after 1977, after March the 4th, 1977, when it was an earthquake and it took down most of Bucharest. So as a result, that presented a good opportunity for the socialist architects. Let's rebuild the city the way we imagine it. That way we don't have to expropriate anyone, because everything is torn apart anyway because of the earthquake. But again, at that time the regime was already not so wealthy as it had been 10 years before. So as a result, we got even a smaller version of the already fucked up architecture that the Swiss guy came up with. There are two capital cities in the world, yes, that voluntarily took down their old towns to replace them with communist architecture. Do you know what those capital cities are? Bucharest and Stockholm. During the times of Olof Palme, he came up with the Olaf Palme is the only communist dictator in history to be elected voluntarily 4 times in a row. And he would have been elected again
He
if...
was killed, right?
Yes, and in my opinion he was killed about 10 years too late. I mean, some of the Swedes are speculating, oh, the CIA killed him, and I'm like, I hope they did. And in fact, I would argue that the CIA committed the atrocious mistake of leaving that guy, letting that guy to breathe for 10 years too much. In any event, during the times of Olaf Palme, he and, of course, his counselors and whatever came up with the idea called miljonhemmet, the million homes. The idea of building 1 million homes on the public dollar for the people. It's a completely Marxist idea. And they didn't build 1 million homes, but they built about 700,000 of them. And one of the places where they chose to build it was where the old town of Stockholm was, the Gamla stan. What you see today in Stockholm when you go in the area called Gamla stan is still pretty big, but it was about 4 times bigger. The rest of it was torn down, bulldozed down and replaced with communist blocks. Just like you see anywhere here in Bucharest, you can see them in downtown in Stockholm. Here, the neighborhood called Carmen was destroyed to make room for what is today the Unification Boulevard, at the time the Victory of Socialism Boulevard, that ends in the Ceausescu's palace. The People's House was at the time. Today the House of the Parliament, well, a portion of it is the House of the Parliament, the rest of it is, well, about a third of it is unused, essentially, because it's so huge that, I jokingly propose that it should be rented to, build a mall there or something. But apparently there is enough opposition to that idea, so for now it's going to stay unused. But it is my opinion that if we can't take it down, because it would be too expensive to bulldoze it down, because it was built to withstand earthquakes of 9.2 degrees on the Richter scale, so it's very hard to take it down. It would cost a lot of dynamite to take that thing down. But if we can't take it down, then at the very least we should either sell portions of it, because it consumes too much. It costs about, I think, about 4 million euros per week. Just the electricity, and I mean it consumes like the size of a medium-sized city in Rome. It's very expensive to upkeep it. So I either give for free or sell portions of it, something to just to withstand some of the cost and transfer it to the private sector. Because I'm sure many companies would be thrilled to have their headquarters there, because everyone knows where that building is. So yeah.
And were they built with this surveillance in mind? Or
Surveillance.
Yeah.
You should take a tour of the palace of the parliament. The guy.
I've been there.
You've been, right. So did they take you downstairs at the -1 level?
Mm-hmm.
Did they?
Oh no, just
They didn't. So it's still under renovation. Yes. I've been there twice, in '97 and in 2018. In '97, it was still you could go downstairs and you could see some of the tunnels, because it has underground tunnels to the nearby Minister of Internal Affairs, to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So it had this intention in mind as well, namely to have the government to be able to work in any circumstances. It was prepared essentially for the apocalypse. I'm not joking. But today, as it was told to me in 2018, and you're saying that it's still the case today, there's the -1 level is under renovation, and it's probably going to be a whole museum there, and it's going to be open for tourists relatively soon. But today, if it's not visible, then you'll have to trust my word on it. There are 2 tunnels to take to the most important areas of the Bucharest of 1986, when the institutions that were relevant for the regime were very close to each other. Today, they're not so particularly close to each other. They've been moved around and whatever due to market pressure. But at the time, it was built to have because the idea was what the dictator to be able to get intelligence reports on the fly, in the age of where the internet didn't exist. So one way to do that is to literally build a huge palace and you can drive underground without nobody seeing, because the tunnels were big, were made to be able to drive a huge truck through them and still have room next to it. Yeah, they're very huge. So yeah, I could essentially drive into the Minister of Internal Affairs and get the intelligence report. So yes, they were built also with surveillance in mind, but admittedly, with the case of People's House, surveillance was not the biggest selling point. The biggest selling point was mostly for propaganda purposes, really, because the way it was sold to the populace is that this construction would mark the permanent victory of socialism, and also the permanent victory of self-sustainable economy, because the selling point was that 100% of the materials used in the building are manufactured in Romania, which was almost true, but of course nobody in the communist apparatus was willing to tell you the costs of that.
The money came from Russia, or?
No, the money came from starving us to death.
There were deaths by starving or not?
Not so much. As far as I'm aware, but again, it's very hard to know this because, of course, nobody kept reliable statistics, especially in the 80s. In the 70s, you can find them pretty reliable, but in the 80s, the statistics were pretty doctored. But as far as I'm aware, there's been less than 100 cases of individuals starving to death between 1980 and 1990. And after 1990, there's been like 1 or 2 per year until 95, and then 0. Of course. But the thing is that it's very hard to know whether that number is accurate. It might be higher. I suspect it's slightly higher. Who knows how many old people were just found dead in the house, and because they were 90, there was presumed natural causes, but maybe they starved to death because they couldn't walk and stay in line for 8 hours to get basic food. I don't know how many cases of those were, and nobody can know that aspect. But I presume it was much higher than a few hundred. Yeah, so basically the way the economics worked, in order to answer fully to your question, is essentially like this. March 4, 1977 happens, earthquake fucks up the whole southeast of the country. The regime comes up with the idea, let's rebuild the cities in our own image. And it's most obvious in Bucharest, but it's also, there's a nearby city called Zimnicea, from where only an old 17th century church survived. That's it. Everything else didn't survive. So the whole city is built after 1977. Very similar with the city called Focșani, about 2.5 hours by train from here. Same thing, only 2 or 3 buildings survived. The rest of it is entirely built after March the 4th, 1977. In any event, the thing is that the regime realizes that they can't pay for all of that. It's too expensive. So as a result, they contracted a loan. And the loan was used, like it's always the case with the communists, in a very corrupt way. Significant portions of the money ended up God knows where. But the money that was used in what they say it will be used, it was used to rebuild the cities, but also to build some new factories. 100% of those went bankrupt 3 days after communism fell. They were probably the most useless things ever built. They were entirely built to function only if subsidized. The left never changes. This is the same thing today with the green technology. It's exactly the same phenomenon. That's why whenever I hear green activists, I'm like, guys, I've seen your movie before. I know how it ends. In any event, and in about 90, to make things short, because otherwise, again, we'll be here until tomorrow. In 1980 or 1981, Ceausescu goes into big trouble. First of all, Ronald Reagan reads Red Horizons by Pacepa, and suddenly the US attitude towards Romania moves overnight from relative warmth to outright hostility comparable to the Soviet Union. Yeah, we don't care about your independence. No, you and your whole regime need to be helicoptered tomorrow, preferably. So that's one thing. And second thing, he goes into a fallout with the International Monetary Fund. It's a very complicated story. The short version of it is that Ceausescu decides, even against the advisors were saying, sir, that's wrong. But it's like, no, we're going to do this. We're going to pay the entirety of our international debt in order to achieve full financial independence. Now, the only way to do that is because he did it. On May the 1st, 1989, Romania became one of the first and I think the only few countries in human history who had 0 international debt. But the only way to do that was to starve the population to death. And every single factory in the country had their orders that, look, anything that is really good immediately goes to export. And, the things that are partially wrong and whatever can be sold for the internal market. So immediately the standard of living collapsed for everyone. Well, not for everyone. The apparatchik elite, of course, kept on having a very decent lifestyle, but most of the population's standard of living collapsed. So yeah, that's how it was paid for it, because all of the things in the people's house, because that's where your question started, were built in Romania, so it was considered free. because it's not like we were the laborers were paid anything. And of course, a lot of the building itself was done with free labor. There was military conscripts being used. About 100 people died during the construction work. Well, that's the official number. It's probably more than that. I suspect it's more than that. So yeah, that's how it was paid, by making everything here, and all the raw materials that were found here. Again, there was and the few things that had to be imported, the raw materials from the hard currency, gotten by exporting essentially everything that was not useful.
If I may, I would like to put a last question that brings us back to a matter that interests us all, given that we are all students in the sake of knowledge, and we can notice very clearly that you had a quick way of talking at first, but also of thinking. You respond quickly to concrete events, as I could see today at the telephone, and here just chatting. And well, you don't look too old, even if I'm not allowed to know your real age. But on that sense, do you have, I can presume, a lot of dedication and effort in the quest of knowledge and even the virtues that are necessary to know what you know and do what you plan to do. Can you make any comment on this? And even if you have counseling is the English word, counseling?
Advice, probably.
And advice for those who are here, and we are here for each one in his own particular way, but we are looking for, we are on a quest of knowledge and the virtues that are necessary to obtain it.
All right. Well, that's a bit more complicated. See, I'm not always quickly answering. If it's things that I've thought about, if it's things that I thought about in the past, then I already have the line of reasoning, and it just needs to be adapted to the question. That's why I kept on coming to the people's house, just to make sure I'm not losing your question. Right, on seeking knowledge and wisdom. To me, as I alluded to this a few tens of minutes ago, or probably an hour ago, that I alluded to this, that it was more or less accidental. I just suddenly became interested in this, but then I liked it so much and I didn't stop. So I don't know if it's accidental for everyone. I presume it's not. Some people are groomed into that, or they are brought up by their parents into becoming men of knowledge, essentially. But whether it's accidental or not, it's just something that takes, as you said, a lifetime commitment. I mean, it really is, because even at the end of your life, you still don't know anything, really. I mean, no matter how much knowledge and wisdom you might at best, gather 0.0001% of the knowledge that exists out there in a lifetime, if you're lucky and if you're really dedicated to it. Most people don't even get that far. But I think it requires, first of all, a sense of humility. And in the sense that, and this is maybe sounds weird for the fans of my channel who are accustomed to me promoting individualism, because in the modern culture it's regarded that humility and individualism somehow go against each other. They don't. One can be an individualist and at the same time being humble. And by humbleness, I mean understand that the world doesn't start with you and it doesn't end with you. You matter as an individual, have a unique moral value, but the world will not end with you. And it did not start with you. And because it did not start with you, it falls on you, if you want to be a man of knowledge for sure, to understand how things went, at least in the last 300 years before you were around here. Probably even, preferably more than 300 years, but at the very least the last 300 years. Be knowledgeable in that. And then understanding that it will not be over with you, then try to teach others younger than yourself, because they will be there once you'll be done, and that's how you get your stake in the future. Whether they're your biological children or young people that you happen to teach it, from a knowledge and wisdom perspective, it doesn't really matter. From an evolutionary perspective, of course, it matters to be for them to be your biological children, but from a knowledge and wisdom, not so much. So yeah, the advice that I give: travel. I'm serious about this. This is the part where everyone hates me, because they're like, oh, but we can't all be like you, man, because you go everywhere. Well, nobody says be like me. I know I'm obsessed with some of the things. I mean, I know. And I take responsibility and accountability for that. But I just happen to like to know as many countries and cultures as possible. I have my own obsession with border areas. That's why, for instance, one of my favorite countries is Cyprus, because it has a literal hard border in the middle of the capital city, and you cross that border and you're instantly in another civilization. So, the south is Crusade tier type of civilization, the north is the Ottoman Empire. And it's more Ottoman than mainland Turkey, because because it's a border area. Both sides have amped up the things. Same thing happened with the borders of the Roman Empire. Rome itself was less Roman than some of the periphery. It's probably why the Romanian language is much closer to the standard Latin, because here the empire ramped it up even more, because it was a border area and you have to make sure it stays within your border and you have to reinforce it. My obsession with border areas aside, traveling a lot tends to help, because that's how you understand. No, that's how you end up saying a lot of times, much to the dismay of a lot of people, that it's a little bit more complicated than that. For instance, because I've been to so many Islamic countries, I still hold the same mainstream right-wing opinion, namely that mass Islamic immigration into Europe is bad. But I no longer hold it for the same reasons. I have a lot more deeper reasons for which I believe this would be a danger, because I've been there and I've seen, and it's a little bit more complicated than, but there's stealth jihad, and well, no, not really. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's the little things, the habits that individuals from the Islamic civilization that bring with them, that those are a lot more dangerous than the religion itself. For instance, very few people know that there are many areas in the Islamic civilization where the people are rarely at the mosque.
Where they are?
Rarely at the mosque. They're in many ways, Morocco, for instance, is as post-Muslim as Germany is post-Christian, but they still retain the Islamic civilization, the habits and the culture of the Islamic civilization, even though they don't pray to Allah that much. And that still makes it dangerous for mass immigration from there, because they bring the customs and the civilization with them, which that is incompatible with ours in large numbers, because we can't integrate that many large numbers. It's true the other way around too, of course. I mean, if we were to move 80 million Europeans into Morocco would cease to be Morocco. It would be, Europe.
Can I put one last question? You mentioned before the whole of the communist nations, let's say, in the beginning of this radical Islam, for example, Yasser Arafat and this kind of stuff. Can you talk more about this? How the leftists, how the communists built in some way this, and then how the situation is now, because it seems that now they became quite independent on the left, and also a kind of rivals to the left.
Now, the reasons for which the Bolsheviks, the Soviet Union, invested so heavily into these kinds of movements was a very prosaic one. Essentially, they were looking at areas that were still unclaimed, that were neither of the West nor of the communist world, or who were of the West but were kind of weak, such as the Shah regimes in Iran, the pre-Islamic Iran. That was a region of the West, but the regime was pretty weak. So, or Afghanistan, which was an unclaimed territory. So, the Soviets were like, let's spread communism a bit more. Or at the very least, stop the expansion of the West. If we can't give them communism, at the very least, let them not be Western. And one of the ways to do that in certain areas, Afghanistan is one of the areas, Iran is probably the most obvious example, and of course, quote-unquote, Palestine, because there it was the issue that there was a fallout between Ben-Gurion, who was the founder of modern state of Israel, who himself was a leftist, but he was not a Bolshevik. And as a result, Israel became a capitalist country over time, and definitely of the West. And of course, Stalin didn't particularly like that, and neither did anyone that followed Stalin at the head of the Soviet Union. So as a result, okay, let's fund something that at least stops the Western expansion in the Middle East. So they funded, at least in part, the Islamic Revolution in 1979 in Iran. And of course, Yasser Arafat and several other movements were even smaller than that. For instance, I'm thinking of Milli Görüş, which is an organization of very, very radical Islamist organization from Turkey, because Turkey was a NATO state. But, you know, the Soviets were like, yeah, but they have a very long Islamic caliphate tradition. Maybe we could use that. As it turned out, it wasn't particularly successful, but they tried. And Milli Görüş, for a very long period of time, was getting its funds from... and it succeeded eventually now. The Soviet Union is not around, but Recep Tayyip Erdogan is one of the exponents, the first students of the Milli Görüş Madrasa network, which was, at least in part, funded by the Soviet Union. So, you know, some of that's why I'm saying that for civilizational scale, things are a little bit more complicated. The Soviet Union is not here anymore, but some of the effects of Soviet policy are still being felt to this day, and it's going to take a while until all of these projects die. So this is the reason why the left plus Islam equals love in historical terms. Now, in present day, the justification is a little bit different, but it's only the words that are different. The fundamentals are the same. Stopping the West, or destroying the West, or undermining the West. It's still the same reasoning, but the justification is a little bit different. Like, you know, Muslims are people of color, and therefore they're oppressed, and therefore need to be protected against the evil white man, and things of that nature, even though there is about 1 million white and blonde Muslims in Bosnia. So, you know, I mean, the idea that being against Islam makes you a racist is something really stupid, and it comes from a very low IQ area of knowledge. But in any event, the justifications for the plebs have changed a little bit, but the fundamentals are the same. It's still regarded as one way to undermine the West. And it's a very efficient way, because Islam is a relatively stable civilization. It's definitely big, which tends to help. And it's a civilization that wants to live. And not only wants to live, wants to expand, wants to thrive. Whereas the West slowly has become a civilization that is unsure whether it wants to survive, let alone to live or to thrive. I mean, that's already a different question. So yeah, that's why the left today is very enamored with Islam. And of course, there is also this devil's bargain that the left has been doing, and essentially that we're going to use the Muslims to undermine the West and then bring about the communist revolution. What many of them don't seem to understand is that the usage is the other way around. Because if Islam is successful, there's not going to be a Bolshevik revolution. It's going to be Allahu Akbar, and all the leftists get hanged first. Yeah. But of course, you don't try to tell that to the leftists, because they'll say you're a far-right conspiracist or something. Because, as we all know, these days the record of history is a far-right conspiracy. So, you know, just because the Muslims have done this every time they were able to conquer a society, it doesn't mean they'll do it again. And I'm like, yes, they will. Because the Islamic civilization didn't particularly change, at least not in the last 1,000 years, and especially, or if it did change, it changed for the worst. I was having this conversation last night with a student of mine about the Ottoman Empire, which was essentially a heresy to the Hadith, because the Ottoman Empire allowed for the existence of something called Dar al-Akhd, the House of Treaty, and unlike Muhammad, the Ottoman Empire was actually abiding by the treaty, which is something, it's very un-Quranic. In fact, in the Quran, and especially in the Hadith, in the life of the Prophet, it says that you sign a peace treaty when you're weak, but once you get strong, you screw the treaty, you attack again. Whereas the Ottoman Empire was a little bit more reasonable on this, and that's probably one of the reasons why the Ottoman Empire survived for that long and at that size, longer than it should have. But yeah. So, but after the fall of the Roman Empire, there have been a lot of radical collectives within the Islamic civilization, and yeah, the narrative of the more expansionist versions, the Deobandis, the Wahhabis, and a few others even more radical than that, for the time being, not for the time being, between the 70s and I would say about 10 years ago, those were the ones that dominated the narrative. Today things are changing again. There are a lot of other versions of looking at the world from a Muslim perspective, and one of those might win out against the Wahhabi. Whether those will be better or worse, it remains to be seen. It depends on which of them wins. And yeah, that requires several years. That's why I'm learning Arabic, because I want to start studying some of those and be able to have more definitive answers to that particular question. For now, I would say that there are a few of them in Egypt who are, in my opinion, going in a more salient and decent direction. And there are a few of those in United Arab Emirates who are also going in a more decent direction. But at the same time, there are a few of them funded by the Iranian state who are going in an even worse direction than it is now. So, yeah. I still haven't touched on what? Oh yeah, on minorities. Still curious about
Yes,
that?
of course.
Okay. Yeah. So So you're so
And also the foundations.
what?
These big foundations of Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, Clinton.
Oh yeah, the foundations. Yeah, that's a bit more complicated. But yeah, so yeah, with the minorities, I don't think that's really a topic, a complicated topic, because I think the story has been told already several times in public. It's essentially the story of the Western leftism. Western leftism differing from the Soviet leftism in two important ways. One, Western leftism did not have a peasantry and working class to rely on for the revolution to begin with, because capitalism had made everyone rich enough that, I mean, the one of the main leaders of the Labour Party in the 70s was complaining, in the United Kingdom, was complaining that capitalism has made the working class bourgeois, therefore making a revolution impossible. And he was right. He was absolutely correct on that. And most of the Western leftists figured that one out even earlier. So that's one difference between Western leftism and Soviet leftism. The second one being, of course, the increased emphasis on culture, which comes from the old Frankfurt School tradition, starting with Gheorghe Lukács, who ruled the first cultural Marxist government in the world, and then continuing on with Gramsci, Adorno, Horkheimer, Bacchus, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you're all familiar with what I'm talking about. So these are the main two differences. And of course, the third one is being that, at least in public, you don't proclaim yourself as totalitarian. You know, Western leftism proclaims itself as, democratic socialism. And think, we're not going to build the gulags. Of course they will. If given power, they will build the gulags. But of course, because they haven't been given absolute power, they haven't built the gulags. But they will. If we're ever unfortunate enough to end up being ruled by Bernie Sanders type of people, there will be gulags. In any event, so these are basically the differences between Western and Eastern leftism. And as a result, without a working class to rely on, or a peasantry class, you need to build your coalition against the capitalist system by something else. And they came up with the idea, okay, let's use minorities. The problem is that minorities, as the name says, they're minorities. Not enough to win elections with the minorities. But then what if we put all of the minorities together? Well, they're still minorities. That's why they're called minorities. So as a result, that's when the left slowly, and again, it took them about 25 years to come up with this thing that we now call it the LGBT agenda. We have to remember, the biggest homophobes in modern history are the left. Everyone knows what Che Guevara used to do to the homosexuals, or what Cuba used to do to the homosexuals, not to mention the Soviet Union. In Romania, homosexuality was illegal only during the communist period, never before, never after. So the left has a very long history of homophobia. But when they decided to use the coalition of minorities against the system, well, they're like, okay, but we have to reform a little bit our own as well. So it took them about 25 years until they came up with the idea and until it became fully implemented, because even the left needs a generation and a half to reform itself civilizationally, because again, as much as I don't like leftists, are also people, so they function exactly like everyone else. So yeah, so that's why they became obsessed with minorities, because if from I'm talking here about the chief ideologues, not the average activist NPC that you meet on the internet or on the protests. No, those people have no idea what's going on. But the smarter ones on the left, the smarter ones are thinking it very, very cynically. They're like, we have to play the power game, and we have to gather a coalition that is big enough to overcome the system. So, in the United States, okay, so blacks are 13%. If we get 11 out of those 13%, that's still good enough. They usually get about 12 out of 13. That's why they're very scared now with the overturns that the Trump campaign is doing in the black community, because they know that if they lose even 3% of the black vote, they're done winning the national election for the next 40 years. They know it. That's why they're so obsessed. Maybe some of you are familiar with the work of Candace Owens. Candace Owens is a very efficient black conservative activist. She goes in the middle of the what they call inner cities, areas where majority black people live, and that's where she talks to them about fiscal conservatism, about social conservatism, because one thing that the left didn't take into account is that most of the black people in the US are conservative. Yeah, they may be voting Democrat, but they are conservative. If you talk to them about real life issues and take them by policy, almost all of them are almost entirely consistently conservative. I mean, think about it this way. Church attendance in the US may seem low, but if you look at black churches, church attendance is pretty high, which is, again, makes them a natural conservative constituency. But for many years, Republicans have been very fearful of addressing it because they fell for the whole "you're a racist" kind of narrative. And nowadays, that's why the left is scared. The Trump campaign is like, screw the rule book. No, we're not racist. You're the racist. You're the powerful party that founded the KKK. Let's go speak with black people. And that's why they're scared, because if they lose even 2 or 3 percentage point of that vote, they're done. So yeah, okay, we can do that, but we don't have enough. 13% is still not enough. Okay, let's get all of the weirdos with us, mental health patients. There was the left that militated. It's true in Italy as well, by the way, militated for abolishing the mental health institutions and releasing all of the people with serious mental health issues on the streets. This was true in the US, it was true in Italy, and I think it was true in Spain as well, but I might be wrong on Spain. But definitely true in Italy and the United States, because these ones I've studied and I know for sure. There you go. Okay, let's get weirdos, let's get obviously racial minorities, but then again, not enough. Okay, then they created this whole thing of, I'm not exactly white, I'm 10% whatever Indian and something. So, there you go. There's another minority for you. Then they worked really hard to change the definition of what white means. This is true in the US. Even during Obama years, the definition of white people is someone with direct linkage to the original peoples of Europe, North America, and the Middle East, which is a fair definition. But the modern left doesn't look at it like that way. That's why you get people like Rashida Tlaib, who is whiter than me. She's a person of color because she's from Lebanon. And I'm like, yeah, Lebanon is full of people of French descent and Polish. But they're people of color, So it's all a power game, essentially. Because if you look at the pro-minority discourse that comes from the left, it's all in power language. It's the language of power. It's not the language of let's be reasonable, let's bring equality under the law or any of that nature. No, that's liberals. The left is purely in power. There aren't enough black faces there, therefore we don't have enough power. We need more power. Because the left only thinks in terms of power, and they hope, I'm not so convinced that they're right on that one, but they hope that if they can achieve the ultimate intersection of victory, they could undermine the West. Now the thing is that they might succeed if they don't wake up in time about the fact that one of those minorities is of course Muslims, and of course it might not work eventually for them because the coalition is getting bigger and bigger, because that was the point, to create a coalition of minorities to undermine the society. But the coalition is starting to have problems with each other. Because you have feminists on one hand and you have transgender activists on the other hand. There's no way those two can mix together. I mean, in France they went so far as the feminists made an alliance with the Catholic Church to stop the advancement of the transgender agenda. Because everyone recognizes that the transgender agenda is so insane. Okay, fine, no. You know what? The church is the patriarchy, but the church is still better than those people. And then, of course, you have the whole LGBT lobby and the radical Muslims, like Ilhan Omar, for instance, I'm thinking. The House representative, I think, from Minnesota, who's like literally a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Hamas, something like that. She married her own brother to get US citizenship. I mean, it's a very, very complicated story. that person cannot sit in the same room with the LGBT lobby, because back where she comes from, let's just say that the LGBT lobby doesn't get much very nice treatment. I mean, Islamic Somalia doesn't tend to be the one of the most gay-friendly places in the world. Let's put it this way. So there's going to be fractured within that coalition. Now, in Brazil, they will probably they had more luck in it than in the US, because in Brazil, almost everyone can be a racial minority, because almost everyone is mixed somehow. So as a result, almost anyone can reasonably be a racial minority. And if you introduce enough peer pressure and enough Marxist trash in the schools, which Brazil has plenty of it, so peer pressure, Marxist trash in the schools, and the inherited situation, which didn't exist in the US, but it existed in Brazil, where most people are racially mixed somehow, then they had a little bit more luck with the whole minorities things. Because, technically Brazil is a minority-majority country, right? I mean, most, because even the terminology is terrible. As Olavo de Carvalho teaches us, we should avoid using their language, because what they mean by minorities is non-white people, which is a very, if you excuse me, it's a very Nazi way of looking at the world, quite frankly. I mean, but yeah, so that's what they mean when they say minorities. They mean non-white people. But even that is a bit schizophrenic. I mean, the American left is really interesting when they say, Latino people. And I'm like, okay, I'm Latino. My native language is Romanian, is Latin-based. But no, not that kind of Latino, no. Non-white Latinos. Okay, let me bring my friend from Macau. His native language is Portuguese. Is he good enough? No, because he's bourgeois, so no. So every time you ask questions, you run into trouble, because these categories are very flexible and very poorly defined, and that creates a lot of animus within the left-wing coalition. But why do they want to do that, and why did they do it? Is because they thought it would be a good way to undermine the West. And you also asked how. Well, I explained how, essentially by Marxist trash in schools and peer pressure. Because as it turns out, if you can convince a community that they're minority and they're oppressed, they're going to police each other's opinions. You don't have to do much of it. This is one of the failures of the Soviet communism, who believed that the state can centrally enforce it. Whereas the Western left is slightly smarter, say, no, we just have to police the influencers in the community, and they'll do the rest. And the state doesn't have to be that big and that intrusive. Because people naturally perceive the state to be a bit too intrusive. But if the priest works for the left, then you're going to trust the priest, because you're naturally inclined to trust the priest anyway. That's why you've seen a lot of these the current Pope is one of a good example. Leftist infiltration within churches, not just Catholic Church. It's true. What is the Unitarian Church? I think it's called, the church where Hillary Clinton used to go. That's a far left organization, essentially. It's a far left with a cross, essentially. And there is another this kind of neo-Protestant or dare I say heretical type of church, which had a World Congress held in this was about 3 months ago. They had a World Congress in I believe New York, somewhere in the States anyway, to vote on whether their church should accept gay marriage or not. And the no side won by 55%. Because the bishops from Africa and from Eastern Europe and from Asia were like, no, I can't go back to my community and say we're all for gay marriage now. It's just not going to work like that. And the Western bishops, of course, voted for yes. And now they're probably going to have their own schism over that. I mean, think about how insane this sounds. I mean, if this discussion had taken place 100 years ago, I would sound like a total loon to say, in the future there will be churches who will have a schism because of gay marriage. The whole notion sounds insane by 100 years standards. So that's why and that's how. Infiltrating institutions, particularly schools, but not just schools, churches as well. As for the culture, there is also a failure of our own as normal people. Very few normal people go into doing culture anymore. I mean, I am aware of a few normal people who happen to be, movie directors, movie producers, whatnot. But there's still very few of them. And part of the reason is, again, pretty economical. I mean, Probably if my son said he wanted to be a Hollywood producer, I would say he's insane. I would prefer him to be a lawyer or a doctor or a man of knowledge or more something that I would deem more useful. And we as normal people have to change a little bit ourselves, because it is to our benefit for more normal people, again I don't say conservative, normal people, for more normal people to become involved in culture. Because one way the left wins in the culture is because we don't even go to the match to play. They win because we don't even attend the match. So yeah.
And is it true for the Orthodox Church as well?
Depends on which Orthodox Church you mean. If you mean Russian Orthodox Church, is absolutely true. If you mean the smaller Orthodox churches, not so much, depends, maybe it's a little bit more complicated. The Russian Orthodox Church has been, of course, thoroughly infiltrated by the KGB over the time. Some of those priests have been excommunicated during the post-communist period, but then again Putin came to power, started bringing some of those back in. I mean, think about Dugin, for instance. His ideas have been declared satanic about 15 or 16 years ago, and nowadays the Russian Orthodox Church, well, basically invites Dugin at their own TV stations. So, you know, it's very complicated. In Romania as well, there were many priests, and some of them are still active, who used to voluntarily, so they were not forced, they used to voluntarily collaborate with the Securitate. Some of those have been expelled, but many haven't. They're still around. Of course, now they're pretty old, so biology will take care of them. But the leadership, at the very least, in the Romanian Orthodox Church has become a lot better than it used to be. In Serbia, the leadership is thoroughly pro-Russian in the Serbian Orthodox Church. In Bulgaria, it's a bit more mixed. So, you know, for instance, in Romania, it's about 2/3 is against Russia, probably 80%. In Bulgaria, it's probably about 50-50. In Serbia, it's exactly the opposite to here. 20% against Russia, 80% deeply pro-Russia. And again, in Serbia, there's also the civilizational issue of the 1997 bombings by NATO, which turned the country forever well, not forever, but at least for the next 50 years, into a pro-Russian direction, even though Serbia and Yugoslavia overall as a state was known to be anti-Russian. The propaganda was good enough in 1997 to change that. Just like in Ukraine, the country was historically very pro-Russian, and the invasion of Crimea and the Luhansk and the Donetsk regions turned the country almost overnight against Russia. So, you know, sometimes there are these kinds of black swan events that change things really fast. And sometimes the change is permanent, sometimes it only lasts for a decade or two.
I'm afraid we'll have to finish now to our next activity at Philippe's place.
Okay.
But we are not forced to finish here, as I think I talked in the name of everybody. We would love if you can come to dinner with us after. If smoking is allowed, then I will. We do know a place here where smoking is allowed, the Taverna. Yes.
That restaurant from yesterday.
Karakubeli also, yeah.
But we need to reserve a table outside.
I will reserve outside, and that's it. So we have a yes.
We'll see what happens, because the thing is that, you know, I landed yesterday. I didn't even have the time to do enough things, and tomorrow I have to leave. Have to pack back my equipment, because I came with all of my equipment. We'll see what happens.
Okay, well, we're glad to have you with us.
Thanks a lot for the honor. I really don't think I deserve to be here, but if you think it's
totally, yes.
Okay.
We are very happy.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I hope you learned a few things useful. Thank you.